The Hundred Years' War was not merely a long military conflict between two European kingdoms. It was, above all, a historical process that shaped the destinies of France and England over the course of more than a century, from the year 1337 to 1453. Its name suggests a continuous, uninterrupted century of warfare, but the reality was far more complex. It consisted of a series of military campaigns, truces, periods of apparent peace, dynastic disputes, internal revolts, and social transformations that, together, defined the political landscape of Western Europe. Although the conflict began as a dispute over succession to the French throne, it quickly expanded into a broader battlefield involving economic interests, feudal ideologies, and the slow and painful construction of what we now call national identity. During this extensive period, the crowns of England and France alternated between victories and defeats. Armies marched through ravaged villages, castles were besieged, populations were decimated by battle and plague, and kings died without ever achieving their goals. It was a time when diplomacy was conducted with swords and where faith coexisted with hunger, fear, and war. The 14th century, in which the conflict began, was already an era of crisis and decline for the feudal system. The kingdoms of Europe, bloated by centuries of internal strife and an exhausted economic model, now entered a phase of political convulsion in which the power of the nobility would be harshly confronted, not only by the military rise of the monarchies, but also by the still nascent bourgeois and merchant classes, which began to finance armies and influence decisions. The Hundred Years' War radically transformed the very nature of warfare. The traditional image of noble knights in gleaming armor gave way to the tactical use of infantry, archers, and later, primitive artillery. It was during this conflict that the English longbow demonstrated its devastating power against French troops, and that siege warfare, espionage, and guerrilla tactics became essential tools in any serious military commander's repertoire. Moreover, the war gave rise to iconic figures who continue to inhabit Europe's collective memory to this day, such as Joan of Arc, who embodied religious fervor and French hope in a moment when all seemed lost, or King Henry V of England, who symbolized military ambition and the ideal of the warrior king. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Hundred Years' War was the transformation of what had previously been fragmented fiefs and kingdoms into more cohesive national structures. The notion of a nation, still vague at the start of the conflict, began to solidify through the course of the fighting. The French people, tired of being a perpetual battlefield, began to see the throne not merely as a symbol of authority, but as an anchor of protection and resistance. The same occurred in England, where an early wave of military victories and a growing imperial rhetoric fostered a sense of national pride. The war, therefore, did not merely divide two kingdoms, it forged them into modern states, albeit at the cost of immense destruction and suffering. Finally, it is impossible to understand the Hundred Years' War without examining the broader European context. It was a time when papal authority was being challenged, when the Black Death claimed millions of lives, and when knowledge and faith were engaged in their own silent struggles. The war between France and England reflected a world in transition, a world that still clung to the rituals and values of medieval chivalry, but that was already being shaken by the winds of change, of gunpowder, of currency, of walled cities that would become metropolises. To understand the Hundred Years' War is, therefore, more than to study battles. It is to enter a century of anguish and rebirth. To understand how the Hundred Years' War erupted, one must delve into the dynastic roots that both united and simultaneously divided two of the most influential royal houses of medieval Europe, the Plantagenets of England and the Capetians of France. Both families ruled over vast domains and were bound by ties of blood, marriage, and vassalage, blurring the line between alliance and rivalry almost beyond recognition. At the center of this intricate relationship was a fragmented feudal structure, where kings were often vassals to one another for certain lands, and where the modern idea of national sovereignty was still far from being defined. This system made it possible, for instance, for the King of England to be a technical vassal to the King of France for holding lands such as Gascony, while simultaneously being his political and military rival. The seeds of conflict had been sown centuries earlier, when the English monarchy began amassing vast possessions within French territory. The most emblematic example was the marriage of Henry II of England to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, which granted the English king control over a large portion of southwestern France. This transformed the Plantagenets into lords of lands as rich, or even richer, than the direct holdings of the French king himself, leading to increasingly tense relations with the Capetian dynasty. Over the decades, the French monarchy sought to reverse this situation by stripping the English of their territories through war, strategic marriages, and legal maneuvers, aiming to reassert authority over all of France. However, this process only fueled deep resentment and ongoing territorial disputes, creating fertile ground for future armed confrontations. Tensions between the dynasties escalated when, in 1328, King Charles IV of France died without leaving a male heir. In the absence of a son, a dispute over succession to the French throne began. The Salic law, an ancient French tradition, forbade women from inheriting the throne or passing hereditary rights to their sons. However, Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV of France through his mother Isabella, sister of Charles IV, claimed the French crown based on this bloodline. The French nobility, however, rejected his claim, supporting Philip of Valois, cousin of the late king, who was crowned as Philip VI. For the French, this choice was legitimate and vital to the kingdom's independence, but for the English, it was seen as a direct affront to the dynastic rights of King Edward III. This impasse became the spark that would later ignite an open war. This dynastic dispute was more than a question of inheritance. It was a clash between two models of power, between two kingdoms with distinct visions of authority, honor, and dominion. The Plantagenets saw France not merely as a territory to be conquered, but as a rightful extension of their lineage and entitlement. The Capetians, and later the Valois, saw the English as usurpers, foreign invaders threatening the integrity and sovereignty of the French throne. This conflict of identities, though veiled by treaties and ceremonial diplomacy, was present in every speech, in every behind-the-scenes alliance, and most visibly in every advancing military campaign. It was a war of blood, of symbols, and of centuries. Beyond the struggle for the crown, a complex web of interests intensified the conflict. Flanders, for example, an economically vital and industrially rich region, became a strategic chessboard where the English and French vied for control of wool production, weaving, and trade. Marital alliances, pacts with local nobles, promises of protection, and political marriages were all pieces manipulated by both sides, each trying to weaken the other before swords were even drawn. France found itself surrounded by an enemy with deep-rooted connections within its own territory, while England felt the pressure to maintain and justify its claims across the Channel. It was inevitable that this accumulated tension would erupt, and when it did, it became the longest and most complex war of the Middle Ages. Isabella of France, often remembered as the she-wolf of France, was a central figure in the origins of the 100 Years' War. Daughter of Philip IV of France and Queen Consort of England through her marriage to Edward II, her personal and political trajectory formed the direct bridge between the two royal houses that would later clash in the longest conflict of the Middle Ages. Her significance, however, goes far beyond that of a wife and mother. Isabella was the legitimate connection between the Capetians and the Plantagenets, and it was through her that her son, Edward III of England, would claim the French throne. In a world where alliances were sealed by blood, Isabella's name became both a justification and a political heresy, at times a symbol of legitimate right, at others a violation of France's laws and traditions. The reign of Edward II, Isabella's husband, was marked by instability, favoritism, and internal conflict, placing the Queen in a position of growing distrust and isolation. Her tumultuous relationship with the king, combined with the political humiliation she endured due to Edward's favourites, especially Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, led her to make a radical decision. In 1325, she travelled to France with the young Prince Edward to negotiate territorial disputes in Gascony. There she refused to return to England, and alongside her lover Roger Mortimer, led an invasion that deposed Edward II, crowning her own son as king in 1327. Though seemingly personal, this episode had profound implications for the legitimacy and character of the new English king. Edward III grew up in the shadow of betrayal, the exile of his father, and the overwhelming political influence of his mother, elements that would shape his rule and his actions toward France. Isabella was the sister of Charles IV, the last Capetian king. With her brother's death and no male heir left behind, she became the direct link between the French lineage and the young English king. According to the hereditary logic of many European monarchies, Edward III had a legitimate claim to the French crown, being the direct grandson of Philip IV through Isabella. However, the application of Salic law, the French tradition that prohibited women from transmitting royal rights, barred his claim from being recognized by the French nobility. For Isabella, this rejection was not only an affront to her son's legitimacy, but also to her own status as the daughter of a king. Thus, the conflict was no longer merely political or territorial. It had become personal, dynastic, and deeply rooted in the pride of the royal houses involved. The French nobility's decision to crown Philip of Valois as Philip VI was therefore perceived by the English as a betrayal and an act of usurpation. King Edward III hesitated before declaring war, but hostility was mounting. France supported the Scots against England, hindered English control over Gascony, and contested trade and tax agreements. The provocations were numerous and continuous, until in 1337, Edward publicly declared his claim to the French throne, officially launching the conflict that would last over a century. Though this gesture was made in the name of justice and lineage, it was in essence the formalization of years of pent-up tensions, palace intrigues, and clashing ambitions. Within this context, Isabella of France remains an ambiguous figure. She was the mother of a warrior king, the daughter of a powerful monarch, the sister of a childless ruler, and a woman rejected by her own kingdom. Her personal story is interwoven with the fates of two entire realms, and her presence, though absent from the battlefields, loomed over the decisions made in the early years of the war. By connecting two royal lineages through her blood, Isabella served as the channel through which flowed not only legitimacy, but also resentment, ambition, and the memory of a family divided by politics. The 100 Years' War did not emerge in a vacuum, but in a European continent already strained by deep transformations, structural imbalances, and a complex web of feudal interests. France, with its vast territorial expanse and internal fragmentation, was still essentially a mosaic of fiefs, duchies, and semi-independent counties. Although the French king was, in theory, sovereign over the entire territory, in practice many local lords held near absolute power in their own regions, maintaining private armies, collecting taxes, and deciding alliances independently. It was a monarchy in which the central authority sought to consolidate power, but was frequently challenged by nobles who saw themselves more as peers to the king than as subjects. This environment made France politically unstable, vulnerable to internal betrayals, and slow in its ability to mobilize a centralized military force. Across the English Channel, Plantagenet England was following a different trajectory. Although it too had feudal origins, its system of government was gradually evolving toward greater centralization, with the king exercising more direct control over the territory and the collection of resources. The English monarchy had a vested interest in strengthening its continental holdings, especially regions in southwestern France, such as Gascony, which were vital for the wine trade and for political prestige. More than merely defending old feudal rights, the English kings aimed to expand their influence and wealth, supported by a warrior aristocracy that viewed the conflict as an opportunity for profit and glory. The English model, with its ability to raise troops and levy taxes in a more organized fashion, provided a critical advantage in the early stages of the war, particularly in long-distance military campaigns. Beyond the internal differences of each kingdom, the broader European context also directly influenced the course of the war. The papacy, at the time based in Avignon under strong French influence, held considerable sway in diplomatic decisions and matters of monarchical legitimacy. The fragmented Holy Roman Empire, often at war with itself, maintained an ambiguous stance, supplying mercenaries to both sides as it suited their interests. Meanwhile, Flanders, a wealthy and densely populated region, became the epicenter of commercial tension. Economically dependent on English wool for its textile industry, but politically subject to French authority, its population and merchant elite vacillated between pro-English rebellions and attempts to reconcile with Paris. The war, therefore, was not merely a contest between two kings, it was a struggle for dominance in a decentralized Europe, where every alliance had the potential to shift the balance of power. Another crucial factor was maritime commerce and control over trade routes. The English Channel, which separated England and France, was a vital artery for transporting troops, supplies, and wealth. English naval supremacy during the early decades of the war offered a strategic edge, enabling swift and devastating incursions into French territory and facilitating the maintenance of conquered lands. France, with a less developed naval structure, relied on alliances and port defenses to resist these invasions. English control over French coastal regions, such as Calais, provided not only logistical and symbolic footholds, but also exerted economic pressure on the French crown. Within each kingdom's borders, the war also had profound psychological and social impacts. In France, political instability fueled mistrust between the king and the nobility, while the peasantry suffered from looting, excessive taxation, and the constant threat of new campaigns. In England, although the population was less directly affected in the early stages, the ongoing need for war funding fed social tensions and required more frequent sessions of Parliament, which indirectly strengthened the institution and laid the groundwork for a clearer model of political representation. Thus, the conflict reshaped not only maps and bloodlines, but also social and political structures on both sides of the Channel. In short, the backdrop to the 100 Years' War was a continent on the brink of transformation, a feudal system in crisis, monarchs seeking to centralize power, cities gaining economic influence, and a populace torn between feudal loyalties and a still nascent sense of national identity. France and England, though bound by blood, trade, and centuries of interaction, became the protagonists of a long and brutal contest that would not only redefine their borders, but also herald the end of the Middle Ages as it had been known. The war on the horizon was no longer an isolated conflict. It was the harbinger of a new era of centralized kingdoms, emerging military technologies, and evolving identities. The definitive spark of the 100 Years' War was a dynastic succession crisis that, at first glance, might have seemed like just another palace dispute among the many fragmented kingdoms of medieval Europe. However, the death of Charles IV of France in 1328, without male heirs, ignited a conflict that had long been smoldering beneath the surface. With the end of the direct male Capetian line, a dynasty that had ruled France since the 10th century, the succession to the throne descended into a murky terrain of traditional laws, political interpretations, and power games. The fundamental question was, who had the legitimate right to succeed Charles IV? And beyond that, who had the military might and political backing to sustain that claim? On one side stood Philip of Valois, cousin of Charles IV, son of Charles of Valois, and grandson of Philip III of France. His claim rested on a direct male lineage, which, according to the Salic law, the customary legal tradition in France, made him the most appropriate candidate for the throne. Salic law prohibited women from inheriting the throne or transmitting royal rights to their sons. Therefore, any claim through the maternal line was deemed invalid under French tradition. On the other side was King Edward III of England, direct grandson of Philip IV, father of Charles IV, through his mother Isabella of France. For the English, this connection was sufficient to legitimize Edward's succession. For the French, it was unacceptable. The Assembly of Nobles in 1328 chose Philip of Valois, who was crowned as Philip VI of France. The decision reflected not only an interpretation of the law, but also a clear political move to prevent a foreign monarch, especially an English king, from assuming the French throne. It was a matter of sovereignty and the preservation of internal power. The decision deeply angered Edward III, who initially accepted the verdict, perhaps because he was still consolidating his authority in England after the deposition of his father. However, as years passed and tensions rose, the claim to the French crown became a matter of honor and a powerful diplomatic tool to justify future military campaigns. This dynastic tension escalated within a climate of ongoing provocation. Philip VI demanded Edward III's fealty as Duke of Gascony, a territory that still belonged to the English crown, but was considered a French fief. In 1337, after a series of trade disputes, territorial conflicts, and French support for Scotland, England's traditional enemy, Philip VI officially confiscated Gascony. This act was seen as a direct violation of Edward's feudal rights, to which he responded with a formal declaration. He claimed the French throne in the name of his lineage and declared himself the legitimate heir of Charles IV. With this, the conflict ceased to be a quarrel among nobles and became an open war between two kings, with the very fate of France at stake. The ascension of Philip VI, therefore, was far more than a dynastic choice. It marked the definitive rupture between England and France, transforming hereditary disputes into a struggle over sovereignty, identity, and power. The kings were not merely fighting over territories, they were waging war over a vision of authority and opposing ideas of royal legitimacy. France, by crowning Philip, reaffirmed its independence and its refusal to be ruled by a foreign king. England, by contesting that decision, launched a campaign that sought not only military conquest, but the very ideal of a transnational empire led by the House of Plantagenet. This was the moment when war ceased to be imminent and became inevitable. Edward III of England, crowned while still a teenager after the deposition of his father, grew up in an environment of political instability, palace conspiracies, and family conflict. Yet upon fully assuming power, after removing his mother Isabella of France and his former guardian Roger Mortimer, Edward revealed himself to be a monarch with both strategic insight and great ambition. His reign would not only mark a new phase for the English monarchy, but also the consolidation of war as a legitimate tool for dynastic claims. Edward III's identity was shaped not just by his royal bloodline, but by the political trauma of his youth and the awareness that his French ancestry placed him in a privileged position in the succession to the French throne. He was a king with Plantagenet blood in his veins and a direct maternal heir to the powerful Capetian dynasty. Edward's claim to the French throne did not arise from a sudden impulse. For years he sought to maintain a delicate balance with Philip VI, offering formal homage as Duke of Gascony, while steadily reinforcing his authority within England. However, commercial pressures, French-imposed trade embargoes on English merchants, and France's explicit support for the Scots, England's traditional adversaries, gradually eroded this diplomatic vassalage. When Philip VI confiscated Gascony in 1337, citing Edward's feudal misconduct, the English king responded with a gesture that would forever alter the nature of the conflict. He declared himself the rightful heir to the French throne, invoking his hereditary rights through his mother. It was the first time a king of England positioned himself as the direct rival of the King of France, claiming equal title and legitimacy. Edward's move was not merely symbolic. By proclaiming himself King of France, he changed the logic of international relations, framing his military actions as a war of restitution rather than conquest. This stance also enabled him to build alliances with lords and duchies, dissatisfied with the centralization enforced by Philip VI. His strategy proved highly effective. Through diplomacy, marriage alliances, and promises of protection, he secured the support of Flanders, a region of immense economic importance, as well as other allies in northern France and the Low Countries. This early coalition gave England a solid foundation for launching military campaigns on French soil, backed by local support and framed as legitimate by a nobility discontent with the Valois rule. Throughout the 1340s, Edward III began leading expeditions into French territory, aiming not only to seize land, but also to gain recognition. His army, better trained and equipped, particularly with the renowned English longbowmen, won strategic victories such as the Battle of Crécy, cementing his reputation as a skilled military leader and determined monarch. Simultaneously, he minted coins bearing the titles King of England and France, reinforcing his dual claim and putting pressure on foreign courts and diplomats to acknowledge his legitimacy. For Edward, war was an extension of his rightful claim, and the sword was merely the means of asserting the blood that flowed through his veins. However, Edward's claim to the French crown was not free from internal controversy. Many English nobles viewed the war as a financial and logistical burden, and Parliament was increasingly summoned to approve new taxes to fund the campaigns. This, in turn, indirectly strengthened England's representative tradition, as the prolonged conflict required greater institutional involvement and popular support. At the same time, Edward's initial military successes generated national pride and a growing sense of unity around the monarch, giving England a clearer identity in contrast to the French other, now not just a military rival, but a declared hereditary enemy. Thus, Edward III's claim to the French throne was more than a political move or a personal ambition. It was the breaking point between two bloodlines that had previously coexisted within the feudal order, but now stood as protagonists of a new paradigm, a war between kingdoms in the name of emerging national identities. Edward's gesture ignited a war that would last more than a century, but also forged the image of the warrior king as a symbol of legitimacy and valor. In his figure, the feudal past and the centralized monarchical future converged, shaping a conflict that would span generations, kingdoms, and ideologies. As the Hundred Years' War began to take shape as a prolonged campaign of dynastic and territorial assertion, the construction of alliances became the strategic foundation for both Edward III and Philip VI. It was not simply a matter of open field battles, but of winning hearts, purses, and oaths in a deeply fragmented Europe, where loyalty could be bought, promised, or broken under political and economic pressure. Flanders, Gascony, and other peripheral regions became key pieces on this geopolitical chessboard. From its inception, the conflict revealed itself as a struggle not only for armed legitimacy, but also for diplomatic influence, a battle waged through intricate networks of allegiance that determined where campaigns would be fought and by whom. Flanders, at that time, was one of the wealthiest regions in Europe. Its thriving cities, filled with merchants, weavers, and artisans, depended heavily on English wool to feed its powerful textile industry. Though formerly a fief of the French crown, the Flemish elite welcomed an alliance with England, which offered not only economic security, but also a chance at greater political autonomy. Pressured by urban revolts and local merchants, the Counts of Flanders were gradually compelled to lean toward the English side. Edward III capitalized on this opening, using active diplomacy, trade incentives, and military promises to solidify his alliance with the Flemings. In a symbolic act that united commerce and coronation, he even solemnly swore his claim to the French throne before the burghers of Bruges. Gascony in southwestern France had long been a region of tension. Originally part of Eleanor of Aquitaine's inheritance, it was incorporated into the English crown through her marriage to Henry II. Yet despite its governance from London, Gascony remained technically in a French fief, and this legal nuance fueled ongoing disputes between the two kingdoms. The importance of Gascony extended far beyond feudal legality. Its wine production and strategic coastal location made it essential both economically and militarily. When Philip VI confiscated Gascony in 1337, he not only challenged Edward III, but stripped him of a vital foothold on the continent. England's response was immediate and forceful. Reclaiming Gascony became a top military priority, and the loyalty of the Gascons, often wavering, now became a matter of survival for the English crown. Other, more situational alliances emerged during this period, each shaped by local dynamics and shifting political currents. Brittany, engaged in its own internal war of succession, became a battleground of English and French interference, with each side supporting different claimants to the duchy. In the Iberian Peninsula, England sought ties with the Kingdom of Portugal, while France maintained more stable relations with Castile. In the German territories, the English attempted to sway nobles of the Holy Roman Empire through bribes, trade deals, and marriage pacts, securing temporary alliances, particularly for northern campaigns in France. In all these cases, alliances were rarely forged in iron but in gold. They relied on payments, promises of land, and future protection. These power games gave the war a dimension of permanent diplomatic chess. Each sealed or broken pact altered the course of the conflict, delayed sieges, postponed campaigns, or opened new fronts. Edward III's diplomatic acumen proved nearly as decisive as his battlefield leadership. He understood that to weaken France, he needed to undermine its internal authority and destabilize regions still loyal to the Valois crown. In this arena, commerce, religion, prestige, and fear were as effective as swords. By transforming alliances into instruments of war, Edward expanded his influence without needing to fight at every border. Thus, the early alliances shaped the contours of the war before any major battles had begun. Flanders became a platform for English propaganda and logistics. Gascony, a symbol of feudal resistance against French centralization. And other territories floated between loyalty and calculation, turning the conflict into a continuous spectacle of promises, treaties, betrayals, and reconciliations. Long before arrows were loosed at Crécy or banners raised at Agincourt, the war was already being won or lost in court halls, at banquet tables, and in treasury chambers where kings decided the fate of entire nations. The first phase of the Hundred Years' War, spanning from 1337 to 1360, was marked by a series of remarkable English advances, well-executed skirmishes, meticulously planned campaigns, and a constant interplay of sieges, attrition, and armed diplomacy. Contrary to the classic image of an uninterrupted linear confrontation, this initial stage was characterized by a rhythm of almost wave-like tactics. Periods of intense violence alternated with long truces, negotiations, and political realignments. Edward III revealed himself not only as a capable commander, but also as a patient strategist who viewed war as a continuous process of occupation, symbolic humiliation, and the calculated display of power. At this point, England's objective was not to conquer all of France at once, but to weaken the enemy from within, erode its alliances, and force recognition of Edward's claim to the French throne. One of the cornerstones of the English strategy was the use of chevauchées, fast and devastating raids through French territories. These campaigns aimed to plunder villages, destroy crops, seize fortresses, and instill terror among the peasantry, thereby crippling the economic base of the French monarchy and rendering local nobility powerless. Unlike prolonged sieges, these swift operations allowed the English to cover vast areas quickly, demonstrating mobility, strength, and a sense of impunity. Often led by Edward III himself or his son, the Black Prince, these expeditions were carried out by light, disciplined, and highly motivated troops, particularly the famed English longbowmen, whose effectiveness redefined battlefield engagements of the era. The climax of this phase occurred in 1346, with the monumental Battle of Crécy. Edward III landed with his army in Normandy and advanced inland, provoking Philip VI into battle. Fought under heavy rain, the battle showcased English technical and tactical superiority. Longbowmen stationed on elevated ground devastated the French cavalry, which charged in disorganized waves, ignoring the terrain and underestimating the deadly precision of English arrows. It was a massacre that deeply shook France's military confidence and elevated Edward III to the status of war hero. The victory at Crécy not only brought international prestige to the English king, but also opened the path to one of his most strategic objectives, the port city of Calais. The siege of Calais, launched shortly after Crécy, became a symbol of English resolve and French vulnerability. For over 11 months, the English surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and thwarting any relief attempts. The population suffered through starvation, disease, and terror. Calais' surrender in 1347 was a humiliating blow to France. Edward demanded the handover of 6 citizens for execution as an exemplary punishment. Though he later spared their lives, the gesture solidified his image as an implacable ruler. Calais would remain under English control for more than 2 centuries, serving as a vital strategic foothold and military base for future operations. Its possession enabled the English to maintain continuous pressure on northern France, a lasting wound to French pride. This phase of the war was momentarily interrupted by an invisible and far more devastating enemy, the Black Death, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351. The plague decimated millions, halting campaigns, collapsing local economies, and drastically reshaping social structures across many realms. Armies were demobilized, trade routes collapsed, and the fear of death gripped every social class. Amid this chaos, both France and England experienced steep population declines, which directly affected tax collection and military recruitment. The plague acted as a forced truce, but also as a catalyst for structural changes, including transformations in the nature of warfare. Even with the disruption caused by the plague, the English did not lose momentum. In 1356, Edward III's son, Edward the Black Prince, led another chevauchée through southern France and faced King John II at the Battle of Poitiers. Once again, a combination of tactical acumen, mobility, and the use of longbowmen delivered a spectacular English victory. The blow was compounded by the capture of the French king himself, an event that plunged France into political disarray. With the monarch held prisoner in London, the country fell into a phase of internal revolts, such as the Jacquerie, and aristocratic disputes, while Edward III consolidated his status as a ruler of 2 realms. This initial cycle of victories culminated in the signing of the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. Under the agreement, France ceded vast territories in the south and west to England and agreed to pay a massive ransom for King John II's release. In return, Edward III would temporarily renounce his claim to the French throne, but without formally relinquishing it. This treaty sealed, at least for a time, English supremacy in the conflict. However, instead of ending the war, it merely created a strategic pause, masking a conflict that was far from over. The seed of resentment, revenge, and instability remained more alive than ever. The Battle of Crécy, fought on August 26, 1346, stands as one of the most emblematic events of the entire Hundred Years' War. More than a simple military victory, it represented a dramatic rupture in the paradigms of medieval warfare, confronting the ancestral pride of heavy cavalry with the lethal precision of English light infantry and archers. The battlefield at Crécy, located in northern France, became the stage for a silent tactical revolution, where the traditional hierarchy of the warrior nobility was challenged by a force that was disciplined, coordinated, and technologically superior. There, the world of medieval chivalry began to crumble beneath the sharp whine of arrows and the cold logic of rational strategy. Edward III had landed in Normandy with a relatively small but seasoned army of around 12,000 men. After marching through strategic regions, devastating villages, and collecting supplies, the English king positioned his troops on the hills near Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The terrain was favorable, elevated ground with open fields ahead and forests protecting the flanks. There, Edward organized his forces into 3 divisions, placing his archers in a crescent formation, ready to cover the enemy's advance with unrelenting volleys of arrows. On the opposite side, Philip VI of France gathered a much larger force, estimated between 30 and 40,000 men, composed mainly of heavily armored knights, supported by Genoese mercenary crossbowmen and a poorly coordinated infantry. The battle began with the Genoese crossbowmen attempting to break the English line. However, their weapons, rendered ineffective by recent rain and outmatched by the superior rate of fire of the English longbows, failed to make an impact. The English archers, trained to release up to 10 arrows per minute, maintained a constant barrage that disorganized the enemy lines. Chaos deepened when the French cavalry, impatient and uncoordinated, charged directly into the English positions, disregarding commands. In successive waves, noble knights launched themselves uphill, only to be decimated before they could engage in melee combat. Arrows pierced armor, brought down horses, and turned the pride of the French aristocracy into a scene of screams, blood, and twisted steel. The English tactics, based on coordination between archers and spearmen, proved nearly invincible on that terrain. Each time the French cavalry advanced, they were cut down at range. When they attempted to flank, they met firm resistance and precise counterattacks. French losses were catastrophic. It is estimated that between 1,000 and 5,000 knights were killed on the field, including dozens of high-ranking nobles, among them King John I of Bohemia. Despite being blind, he insisted on fighting, tied to the knights of his guard, and died heroically. The defeat was so severe that night fell upon a field littered with corpses, with King Philip VI himself fleeing wounded, narrowly escaping with the aid of his personal guard. The victory at Crécy had both immediate and lasting repercussions. Militarily, it demonstrated that the age of heavy cavalry was in decline, and that discipline, terrain advantage, and intelligent use of technology could overcome the brute strength of mounted aristocratic elites. Symbolically, it elevated Edward III's prestige to an international level. The English king had not only defeated a numerically superior army, he had done so methodically, with composure and with a new logic of warfare. His image was solidified as that of a modern monarch, mastering both sword and strategy, both battlefield and diplomacy. The triumph at Crécy also cleared the path for the siege of Calais and cemented England's presence in northern France for decades. But more than a single military success, Crécy was the herald of a changing era. The battle brutally exposed the flaws of French aristocratic pride and signaled that the future of warfare would be decided not by those with the most titles or the finest armor, but by those who understood the shifting winds of tactical innovation. The field of Crécy thus became not only the grave of thousands, but the silent marker of a new era in European military history. Immediately following his overwhelming victory at Crécy, Edward III turned his attention to a target he had long desired to capture, the port city of Calais. Located on the northern coast of France, with a direct view of the English Channel, Calais was more than just a fortified town. It was a geographical and logistical keystone for any sustained military campaign on continental soil. Controlling Calais meant controlling the narrowest point between France and England, securing a direct supply corridor for troops, resources, messengers, and provisions. At a time when communications were slow and maritime transport could be the difference between victory and defeat, Calais represented a golden opportunity to consolidate a permanent English foothold in continental Europe. The siege of the city began in September 1346, just weeks after the Battle of Crécy, and lasted an astounding 11 months, continuing until August 1347. The decision to maintain the siege for such an extended period, despite its immense logistical costs, revealed Edward III's total commitment to the objective. He knew that if he succeeded in capturing Calais, he would have a fixed position from which to sustain troops in France without relying on distant bases in Gascony. To besiege Calais, the English king deployed a combination of naval and land blockades, cutting off all routes for supplies, reinforcements, or aid to the civilian population. It was a total siege, designed to slowly suffocate the city into submission. Inside the walls, the people of Calais endured increasingly desperate conditions. Hunger, disease, and fear dominated the city. Week by week, food supplies dwindled, morale fell, and hope for rescue faded. Philip VI tried to raise a relief army, but his defeat at Crécy had weakened his position, and the nobility was hesitant to commit to another campaign with such poor preparation. Chroniclers of the time describe how the inhabitants resorted to eating rats, dogs, and even boiled leather in an attempt to survive. The resistance was heroic, but Calais' fate was sealed. By July 1347, the defenders, completely exhausted and at the brink of collapse, initiated surrender negotiations. The surrender of Calais was marked by a dramatic gesture that Edward III used to cement his image as a firm yet merciful king. He demanded that 6 prominent citizens of the city come to him barefoot, kneeling with ropes around their necks and the city's keys in hand, ready to be executed as an exemplary punishment. The gesture symbolized Calais' total submission to the English crown. However, according to the chronicle of Jean Froissart, Queen Philippa of Hainaut, Edward's wife intervened and begged for the men's lives, arguing that their deaths would stain the victory with civilian blood. The king spared them, an act that was widely praised and enhanced his public image as a just and magnanimous ruler. Nevertheless, the city was completely evacuated of its French inhabitants and repopulated with English settlers, transforming it into a British enclave on French soil. The conquest of Calais had profound and lasting effects. The city would remain an English possession for more than 200 years until it was retaken by France in 1558. During that time, Calais functioned as a vital hub for trade, espionage, military operations, and logistical reinforcement. It was in many ways England's continental anchor, a visible symbol of English presence in France. The city featured reinforced walls, well-protected ports, and a permanent garrison. Its control allowed the English crown to send troops and supplies swiftly into northern France, enabling prolonged campaigns without depending on long voyages from England or Gascony. Beyond its strategic utility, the control of Calais had a direct impact on maritime trade. The English Channel was the principal shipping route of northern Europe, and whoever controlled its shores could influence commercial flows between cities such as London, Bruges, and Genoa. English occupation of Calais allowed for the imposition of tariffs, inspections, and restrictions on French ships, while offering protection and privileges to Allied vessels. This further weakened the French economy, already battered by war and plague. The victory at Calais was not merely a military conquest, it was a political, commercial, and psychological blow to the French crown, demonstrating that England could establish and maintain a strong, enduring presence on enemy soil. Thus, the siege and capture of Calais symbolically closed the first phase of the war with a lasting English triumph. It was a demonstration of strategic patience, logistical superiority, and territorial dominance. Edward III had not merely won battles, he had taken root, established a base, and planted a flag that would fly on French walls for centuries. Calais became more than just a port. It was a silent monument to English persistence and to the depth of a war that, despite treaties and truces, was far from over. Just as the Hundred Years' War seemed to be reaching its apex, with England triumphant in Calais and France mired in humiliation and disarray, an invisible and silent threat began to spread through Europe's ports, bringing with it a terror far more devastating than any army: the Black Death. Between the years 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague ravaged the continent with brutal speed, carried by merchant ships, rat-borne fleas, and the constant movement of people. The disease struck populous cities, remote villages, and battlefields alike, claiming lives indiscriminately across all classes, ages, and nations. In a matter of weeks, what began as a localized health crisis escalated into a civilizational catastrophe, directly impacting the core of the Anglo-French conflict. The impact of the Black Death was immeasurable. It is estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population was wiped out, a staggering figure that destabilized every aspect of medieval life. Military campaigns, which required manpower, supplies, and morale, became unfeasible amid demographic collapse. Entire cities stood empty, armies disbanded due to death and desertion, and agricultural fields were abandoned for lack of laborers. Corpses piled up in the streets, church bells rang incessantly, and fear of divine punishment gripped the collective imagination. In many regions, wars were not paused by treaties or surrenders, but by the sheer inability to continue fighting in the face of mass death. Both England and France suffered immensely. In England, the plague triggered a deep economic crisis. With labor shortages, wages rose, and nobles lost control over their estates. Government attempts to curb wage increases through decrees, such as the Statute of Laborers in 1351, led to social tensions that would fester for decades. In France, the situation was even more dire. Already devastated by military defeats, the kingdom now faced urban depopulation, tax revenue collapse, and the strengthening of peasant revolts, such as the feared jacquerie that would erupt years later. The plague spared no one. It struck palaces and slums, monasteries and barracks alike, tearing apart the social fabric that had sustained the war effort. Militarily, the plague forced an informal truce between the kingdoms. Neither side had the real capacity to launch large-scale offensives. Many castles and fortresses were left unguarded, coastal towns turned into ghost settlements, and trade routes, vital for war financing, collapsed. Mercenaries, once employed by kings and nobles, began roaming depopulated regions, forming armed bands that looted what remained of the countryside. It was a time of silent anarchy, where authority dissolved and fear reigned. The concept of war was momentarily replaced by the concept of survival. The plague also had profound psychological effects. The stunned population searched desperately for explanations. Many viewed the pandemic as divine punishment for humanity's sins, and wars between Christians were often cited as reasons for God's wrath. There was a marked rise in religiosity, pilgrimages, public penance, and mass self-flagellations. At the same time, heretical sects and apocalyptic groups gained traction, convinced that the end of the world was near. Even the clergy was decimated, and public confidence in the church, already shaken, weakened further. Kings and nobles, bereft of answers, turned to prayer and vows of righteousness, trying to preserve their crowns in a world where even thrones were at the mercy of disease. Yet while the plague temporarily halted the war, it also laid the groundwork for profound transformation. The dramatic population loss completely reshaped social relations. The scarcity of labor gave more bargaining power to peasants and urban workers. Feudal structures began to erode in many regions, and the notion of the value of labor gained new strength. Simultaneously, economic destruction forced kingdoms to seek new ways of financing and organizing military forces, accelerating processes that would later define the modern state. When the war resumed, the world was no longer the same. Societies were weakened but evolving, and each siege, each treaty, each lament would reflect that new reality. Thus, the Black Death was not merely a parallel episode of the 100 Years' War, it was a turning point. It interrupted campaigns, destroyed societies, redefined alliances, and above all made clear that the power of kings was small compared to the fragility of the human body. It was the silence between battles, the void between arrows, the mourning between coronations. And when swords were raised again, the world had already changed, profoundly, irreversibly, and painfully. The Treaty of Bretigny, signed on May 8, 1360, marked the peak of the first phase of the 100 Years' War. and represented the moment of greatest military, political, and diplomatic advantage for England. After decades of victorious campaigns, devastating skirmishes and strategic occupations, the English reached a point where their presence on French soil was not only militarily solid, but also legitimized by a series of symbolic conquests, such as the possession of Calais, the victory at Crécy, and above all the capture of King John II of France, who had been imprisoned since the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. France, exhausted by the plague, internal revolts, and the loss of royal prestige, found itself deeply weakened and in desperate need of an agreement to prevent total collapse. In this context, the treaty was not the result of a balanced negotiation, but rather a British imposition. The treaty stipulated that France would cede a vast portion of territory to English control. Edward III was granted full sovereignty over regions such as Aquitaine, Poitou, Périgord, Quercy, Limousin, Calais, and other strategic domains in western and southwestern France, forming a true continental empire rivaling the direct holdings of the French king. More than mere fiefs, these lands would now be ruled without any feudal obligation to the French crown, definitively breaking with the tradition that required the King of England to pay homage to the King of France as his suzerain. It was a radical shift in the structure of feudal power and an immense symbolic victory for the Plantagenets, as it signified, in practice, the recognition of English autonomy over a significant part of French territory. In return, Edward III agreed, at least formally, to renounce his claim to the French throne. However, this renunciation was never definitive. It was more of a temporary suspension of his claim, useful for consolidating the conquests already achieved. The signing of the treaty was accompanied by the release of King John II in exchange for an astronomical ransom, 3 million gold écus, paid in installments, and the handing over of noble hostages as guarantees. The sum was so enormous that its payment dragged on for years and plunged the French kingdom deeper into financial crisis, fueling uprisings such as the Jacquerie and tensions between the great noble families and the crown. France paid with land, gold, and pride for the survival of its dynasty. Despite the grandeur of the English conquests, the treaty failed to establish a true peace. In practice, it created a tense and fragile pause, sustained by momentary interests and mutual exhaustion. The French population, far from accepting English occupation peacefully, viewed the new rulers as invaders and reacted with passive resistance, refusing to pay taxes and organizing local insurrections. Furthermore, cultural and linguistic differences between the English rulers and the inhabitants of the conquered regions made administration difficult and draining. In some areas, English officials faced constant hostility, and attempts to impose authority generated growing resentment, creating a fertile ground for rebellion and the reorganization of French resistance. On the English side, although victories were celebrated, the cost of war was already being felt at home. Funding the campaigns had led to high taxes, political friction, and economic instability. Parliament demanded concessions in exchange for new financing, and the general population began to question the continuation of a distant conflict whose fruits were not always visible to the common citizen. Moreover, the possession of vast territories in France required a constant and costly military presence, which weakened England's long-term ability to maintain superiority. Edward III, already aging, began delegating more power to his son, the Black Prince, who would take on the role of commander in future campaigns, but would also face the limitations of a fragile and contested empire. The Treaty of Bretigny, therefore, must be understood less as a final resolution and more as a tense intermission between two major acts of the war. It was an agreement made under conditions of extreme imbalance, in which France accepted humiliations to buy time, and England believed it had secured stability while actually sowing the seeds of future difficulties. For the first time, the map of France was fragmented between two crowns claiming legitimacy, and the French people, though defeated, were not vanquished. Resentment was brewing, and the years to come would be marked by internal reorganizations, unexpected alliances, and above all, the emergence of a new French national spirit that would gradually reverse the advances Edward III believed to be permanent. With the signing of the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, many might have assumed that the Hundred Years' War had come to its end. England possessed vast territories, the French king had been released, and there was a promise, and albeit fragile, ace of peace. But beneath this appearance of stability, France was quietly fermenting a rebirth. In 1364, with the death of King John II, his son ascended the throne as dual Charles V, and with him began an entirely new phase of the conflict, the era of reorganization, strategic resistance, and the slow yet steady process of reclaiming lost French territories. Unlike his predecessors, Charles V was not a warrior clad in armor. He was a political intellectual, astute and meticulous, who understood that English success was sustained more by French disarray than by true military superiority. Charles V, known as the Wise, restructured the French monarchy from within. His first step was to rebuild royal authority, which had been torn apart by military defeats, peasant revolts, and the political fragmentation of the duchies. He appointed capable ministers, reorganized tax collection, strengthened the currency, and restored confidence in the central administration. More importantly, he recognized that the war would not be won through grand open-field battles like Crécy or Poitiers, but through a prolonged war of attrition. Inspired by defensive tactics and strategic patience, Charles V abandoned the traditional model of direct confrontation and instead relied on progressive reconquest, fortified cities, and the strategic isolation of English forces. The centerpiece of this military revival was the brilliant commander Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton knight of humble origins who became the heart of the French resistance. Appointed Constable of France, du Guesclin reorganized the French armies based on mobility, intelligence, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Instead of seeking glory in grand battles, he led harassment campaigns, selective sieges, and ambushes, recapturing strongholds, expelling English garrisons and choking enemy supply lines. His style of warfare was the opposite of chivalric pageantry. It was precise, silent, and effective. Under his command, the French regained key cities such as Poitiers, La Rochelle, and Limoges, gradually reversing the gains made by Edward III. Another decisive factor was the natural decline of English power. The British economy, already burdened by decades of war, could no longer sustain prolonged campaigns on the continent. The Black Prince, once lauded for his victories, began to suffer from serious health issues and faced increasingly fierce resistance from the French. In Castile, England became entangled in a civil war supporting Pedro the Cruel, which ended in failure and further drained English resources and prestige. Domestic pressure mounted. The English Parliament questioned excessive military spending, and common citizens affected by taxes and agricultural crises lost enthusiasm for a war that felt increasingly distant and costly. The tide was beginning to turn, not through a sudden blow, but through a slow and steady structural shift. Charles V also grasped the power of symbolism and propaganda. He sponsored public works, restored palaces, promoted the arts and literature, and cultivated the image of the king as a defender of justice and restorer of order. He founded universities, strengthened the royal bureaucracy, and forged a new relationship with the church, presenting himself as the legitimate sovereign rescuing France from chaos. His reign was a masterclass in historical patience. He never called himself a warrior king, yet his legacy became one of the most strategic and enduring in French monarchical history. By the time of his death in 1380, Charles V had recovered nearly all the territory lost at Bretigny, restored royal authority, and laid the foundations for a new national spirit. Under Charles V, France transitioned from a fragmented and demoralized kingdom into a recovering power with a rebuilding identity and a long-term vision. While England still leaned on the glories of the past, France invested in the future, a contrast that would deeply shape the decades to come. Charles V did not win the war with swords, but with intelligence, discipline, and foresight. His reign marked the turning point between decline and resurgence, a quiet but definitive milestone on the long and painful road to victory. The history of the Hundred Years' War cannot be told without highlighting the figure of Bertrand du Guesclin, the commander who reinvented the way France waged war in the Middle Ages and became the ultimate symbol of resistance against English domination. While previous kings placed their faith in noble-born knights and glorious battles, Charles V saw something different in du Guesclin, a man of humble origins, born in Brittany, with an innate military instinct, a calm courage, and an uncommon understanding of terrain, local populations, and the logic of protracted warfare. Under his leadership, France not only survived, it regained breadth and territory, facing the English with a new strategy, the War of Attrition, which would slowly erode Plantagenet dominance on the continent. Du Guesclin was not the kind of warrior who sought glory in grand open field battles. His tactical genius lay in the art of refusal and precision. He avoided direct confrontations with English armies whenever possible, and instead favored swift operations, ambushes, sabotage, and carefully planned sieges. He knew that France, still weakened, could not meet the English on equal footing, but it could choke their positions, demoralize their troops, and undermine their power through patience and cunning. Under his leadership, the French retook isolated fortresses, intercepted convoys, cut off supplies, and launched methodical reconquest campaigns, each modest victory becoming a solid step toward territorial recovery. Among his most notable campaigns was the reclamation of Normandy and Brittany, two key regions under strong English influence. Rather than launching grand marches or besieging fortified cities with large contingents, Du Guesclin operated through calculated movements, supported by local militias, rebellious peasants, and networks of informants. He mastered the use of terrain. Forests, rivers, villages, and secondary roads became silent allies of his strategy. His warfare was discreet, but effective. Every recovered castle was immediately fortified. Every loyal town was rewarded with tax autonomy and protection, and every traitor was swiftly judged. In no time, his fame surpassed that of aristocratic knights. The English began calling him the Black Dog of Brocéliande, feared and respected in equal measure. Du Guesclin's effectiveness also lay in his deep understanding of English military psychology. He knew the English, accustomed to quick victories and absolute dominance on battlefields like Crécy and Poitiers, were unprepared for a war of attrition that demanded patience, constant resupply, and psychological endurance. As English forces stretched dangerously deep into the French interior, their supply lines became increasingly vulnerable. Du Guesclin struck these lines with precision, forcing the invaders to retreat or split their forces just to maintain control. On many occasions, the English simply abandoned castles and cities due to their inability to resupply them, leaving behind weapons, food, and morale. Another remarkable aspect of Du Guesclin's leadership was his diplomatic skill. He managed to unite rival nobles around the royal cause, offering guarantees, favors, and protection to regional families in exchange for military support. His loyalty to King Charles V was unwavering, and his image as an incorruptible commander won allies even among those who had previously collaborated with the English. His influence extended beyond the battlefield to local courts, where his presence alone could shift the course of alliances. Du Guesclin also led campaigns beyond France, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula, helping to depose Pedro the Cruel of Castile and cementing alliances that further weakened England's position in European affairs. In 1370, Charles V appointed Du Guesclin Constable of France, as the kingdom's highest military post. The appointment was both symbolic and strategic. It signaled that the war was now in the hands of a man who understood that victory would come through exhausting the enemy and patiently rebuilding royal power. From that moment on, the French recovery gained consistency. Within just a few years, the English lost much of the territory they had gained at Bretigny. Cities like Limoges, Bergerac, and Poitiers were retaken. The French troops, once disorganized and scattered, now operated with discipline, geographical intelligence, and centralized strategy. It was a quiet but definitive turning point. Bertrand du Guesclin died in 1380 while besieging the town of Châteauneuf-de-Randon. His death was mourned throughout France, and his body was buried with royal honors in the Basilica of Saint-Denis alongside the kings of France, an extraordinary honor for someone of humble birth. His legacy, however, lived on in the reorganization of the French forces, in the growing belief that the war could be won, and in the certainty that intelligent resistance could overcome the enemy's technical superiority. Through him, France rediscovered its strength, its land, and its soul. Du Guesclin did not win through brute force. He triumphed through patience, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty to a country that was slowly beginning to awaken as a true nation. While kings exchanged crowns, treaties were sealed, and commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin led military campaigns across France, the common people, peasants, artisans, farmers, blacksmiths, monks, women, and children, lived through a silent, brutal, and daily war. For the inhabitants of French villages, the 100 Years' War wasn't about dynasties or diplomatic negotiations. It was the sudden arrival of starving soldiers, fields set ablaze at dawn, the barn looted after harvest, and families fleeing into the woods at the sound of horses' hooves. It was war as a constant presence, a lingering shadow that stretched across generations, touching every family, winter, harvest, and funeral. In many villages, no one even remembered what peace felt like. The impact of the conflict on rural communities was devastating and lasting. English campaigns followed the chevauchés model, fast, destructive raids meant to cripple the economy and terrorize the population, making villages frequent targets. Troops would pass through, burning crops, looting churches, and demanding tribute under threat of death. Men were forced to abandon their families to defend their villages or join feudal forces. Women not only had to manage households, but also defend property, often facing physical violence, rape, and temporary enslavement. Children grew up amidst food shortages, constant fear of soldiers, and nights pierced by distant fires. Political instability and economic devastation eroded the foundation of rural society. Many feudal lords were killed in battle or abandoned their lands, leaving vast regions without leadership or protection. This power vacuum gave rise to bands of unemployed mercenaries, known as free companies, who, without regular pay, became organized thieves, terrorizing the countryside with even greater brutality than regular armies. In many places, people preferred to hide in caves, grottos, or ruins rather than remain exposed in their villages. Religious faith, though a source of strength for some, was also shaken by so much horror. Churches burned, priests murdered, and relics stolen created a widespread sense of spiritual abandonment. Beyond direct violence, there was famine. The constant looting of harvests, systematic burning of food stores, and halted trade routes caused widespread scarcity. Farmers without seeds, plows, or oxen could not plant. The plague, which had devastated the population decades earlier, left fields empty and mills silent. Hunger became a second war, fought within the home, where children died of starvation and adults resorted to eating roots, tree bark, and wild animals. Markets disappeared. Villages that once traded with nearby fairs now lived in isolation, too afraid to travel roads without an escort. It was a forced regression to the most fragile self-sufficiency, cut off from the outside world, unsure of who governed, or if a king even still existed. Yet, amid this tragic landscape, the French people showed extraordinary resilience. Over time, local forms of resistance emerged, information networks between villages, improvised warning systems using bells and torches, and silent pacts between peasants and monks to hide food in crypts. In some regions, women led entire communities, organizing clandestine religious gatherings, teaching children to read and negotiating with soldiers demanding tribute. Countless stories of survival surfaced. Villages tricked scouts by pretending to be plagued. Priests hid wounded English soldiers to maintain peace, and elders told stories of better days by the hearth, unsure if the thunder outside was cannon fire or just another storm. The collective trauma of the war ran so deep that it shaped French folklore for centuries. Popular songs, countryside prayers, sermons, and local festivals carried themes of loss, martyrdom, vigilance, and resistance. Some villages disappeared forever, erased from maps by fire and massacre. Others were reborn with new names, new leaders, and new pacts with God and the land. The generation that grew up during the war learned to live with uncertainty. There was no guarantee of harvest, of justice, or of tomorrow. War became the backdrop of time, the constant rhythm of life. And so, alongside the great names of history, kings, generals, treaty makers, and nobles, we must always remember the nameless, the men who buried their children quickly before fleeing the next raid, the women who fed 4 children with a handful of beans, the elders who counted the years by how many times their homes had burned. These were the anonymous survivors of the 100 Years' War, those who, though they never held swords or signed treaties, carried the soul of a nation that, though broken, never ceased to exist. With the death of Charles V in 1380, France once again plunged into a cycle of instability, this time not because of external defeats, but due to internal collapse that would threaten everything regained in the previous decades. His son, Charles VI, ascended the throne as a teenager, and although initially surrounded by competent regents and backed by a strengthened government, his reign would be marked by a silent and devastating tragedy: madness. Over the years, Charles VI began to suffer increasingly frequent mental breakdowns, alternating moments of lucidity with deep psychotic episodes. In an age when mental illness was poorly understood and often linked to demonic possession or divine punishment, the king's instability became not only a personal tragedy, but a national crisis and a catalyst for widespread disorder. The first signs appeared in 1392, when during a journey in the south of France, Charles VI suddenly suffered a breakdown. He dismounted his horse, drew his sword, and attacked his own entourage, killing 4 men before being restrained by his guards. From that moment on, his condition worsened. In later episodes, Charles claimed not to recognize his wife, believed he was made of glass, and asked for reinforcements in his clothing so he wouldn't shatter. For years, the court was forced to conceal the king's condition, staging an illusion of normalcy while he wandered the palace halls in a trance or remained isolated for weeks. His instability left the throne functionally vacant, creating a dangerous power vacuum at a time when France desperately needed continuity and order. That vacuum was quickly filled by rival noble factions vying for control of the regency and influence over the king. On one side were the Armagnacs, led by the Duke of Orleans, the king's brother. On the other were the Burgundians, led by the Dukes of Burgundy, first Philip the Bold, then his son, John the Fearless. The rivalry between these factions wasn't merely ideological. It involved control of the royal treasury, military decisions, major cities like Paris and Lyon, and even custody of Charles VI himself, who was treated like a human chess piece in their political game. The division ran so deep that it escalated into an undeclared civil war, marked by political assassinations, night ambushes, urban uprisings, and summary executions. The French people, already devastated by war with the English, the Black Death, and famine, now faced an even crueler internal enemy: institutional collapse. Cities became battlegrounds, alternately held by Armagnacs or Burgundians. Taxes rose, justice vanished, and confidence in the monarchy disappeared. In rural villages, no one knew whom to obey anymore, and the war, once seeming endless, returned with renewed force, now lacking even the pretense of an external cause or legitimate leadership. It was the collapse of governance, a return to feudal anarchy, and the unraveling of the fragile order that Charles V had painstakingly built. Meanwhile, England watched closely. With France torn apart from within, King Henry V, who had ascended the English throne in 1413, saw the perfect opportunity to revive the Plantagenet imperial project. As French factions clashed and the Parisian throne stood effectively leaderless, France was a sick body waiting to be invaded. In 1415, Henry V landed in Normandy, launching one of the most successful military campaigns in English history. What made this campaign possible wasn't just England's military strength. It was France's internal chaos, fed directly by the madness of a king who could not rule, yet could not be removed. Charles VI would live until 1422, swinging between brief moments of clarity and long stretches of alienation. His reign, however, became the ultimate symbol of French political vulnerability. His madness wasn't merely a diagnosis, it was a living metaphor for the fragmentation of the state. While England reorganized, empowered its parliament, and solidified its international position, France was disintegrating into internal feuds, palace assassinations, and a monarchy unsure of whom it served. It was a kingdom without center, without direction, without sanity. And like a crumbling tower, France was unknowingly preparing to be shaken, not only by invading armies, but by prophetic voices that would soon cry out for redemption. With France engulfed in internal disorder, Charles VI's madness turning the throne into a powerless shadow, and the noble factions locked in open civil war, the time was perfect for England to renew its continental ambitions. In 1413, Henry V, son of Henry IV, was crowned King of England. Young, determined, and deeply aware of the Plantagenet legacy, Henry quickly saw in France's weakness the opportunity to reclaim Edward III's conquests, and perhaps go even further, realizing the long-standing English dream of uniting the crowns of England and France. But to achieve that, he needed more than ambition. He needed a resounding feat, a victory so overwhelming it would paralyze France and restore English prestige. That victory came in 1415, on a muddy field in Picardy, northern France, in a battle that would be etched into history, Agincourt. Henry V had prepared for his campaign with patience. He built diplomatic alliances, secured political support in the English Parliament, and raised funds through loans and increased taxes. In August 1415, he departed with around 11,000 men toward Normandy, landing at Harfleur. After a difficult and drawn-out siege of the city, which drained resources and claimed many lives due to disease, the English army moved north toward Calais. The march was grueling. It rained constantly, supplies were scarce, and many soldiers were weakened. France, despite its political chaos, managed to gather a large army, estimated at up to 30,000 men, knights, crossbowmen, spearmen, and heavily armed nobles. Upon learning the English were on the move, French forces blocked the way, forcing Henry into an open field battle between the forests of Tramecourt and Agincourt. What followed was one of the most lopsided and astonishing clashes in European military history. The terrain initially seemed favorable to the French, a narrow valley bordered by woods, perfect for trapping the English. But after days of heavy rain, the field turned into a deep mud pit that would trap the French heavy cavalry and make every advance a fight against the earth itself. Henry V, a master of defensive tactics, arranged his men in tight formations, longbowmen on the flanks, protected by sharpened stakes driven into the ground, and a solid infantry line at the center. It was a repeat of the victorious strategies from Crécy and Poitiers, but this time even more dramatic. The French cavalry, bound by their code of honor and glory, charged en masse. Mounted on powerful war horses, nobles clad in ornate armor rode headlong into the English lines. But as they sank into the mud, their heavy armor became a deadly burden. Many fell before reaching the enemy, trampled by comrades or struck down by a relentless hail of arrows. The English longbowmen, steadfast, fired with deadly precision, using the chaos to devastate the advancing French. By the time the first wave reached the English front, they were exhausted, disorganized, and vulnerable. Hand-to-hand combat was brief and bloody. Thousands of Frenchmen were crushed together, unable to maneuver or even raise their weapons. The French defeat was absolute. It's estimated that around 7,000 French soldiers died that day, including hundreds of high-ranking nobles, princes, counts, and dukes. On the English side, losses were minimal, around 400 men. Henry V, ruthless in his pragmatism, even ordered the execution of French prisoners, fearing a renewed assault. The massacre horrified many contemporaries, but cemented Henry's reputation as a decisive and pragmatic commander. The victory at Agincourt had immediate consequences. It demoralized the French nobility, strengthened the Burgundian faction, which was open to English negotiations, and elevated Henry to heroic status in England, inspiring plays, chronicles, and songs that celebrated him as the rightful king of France. But more than just a battle, Agincourt was a symbolic declaration. France, fractured by its own division, could no longer resist the English advance. Henry V now believed the French crown was only a matter of time. His campaign would intensify in the following years, culminating in treaties that would reshape the dynastic balance of Europe. Agincourt was the turning point, where the century-old war was reignited with new purpose and direction, no longer driven by Edward III's memory, but by the calculated will of a new king who saw the sword not just as a weapon of war, but as the tool for final conquest. With the resounding victory at Agincourt and France plunged into an abyss of internal disputes, Henry V solidified his image not only as a conqueror, but as a statesman prepared to claim what his ancestors had merely asserted, the crown of France. Taking advantage of the psychological and political collapse of the French monarchy, the division between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, and the complete lack of effective authority from Charles VI, still alive but mentally incapacitated, the English king launched a diplomatic offensive that would culminate in one of the most astonishing agreements in medieval history, the Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21, 1420. A document that, in essence, excluded the legitimate heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Charles, and granted Henry IV the right to become King of France after the death of Charles VI. To make this treaty possible, a chain of tragic events, political betrayals, and desperate decisions had to unfold. After the assassination of Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy by allies of the Dauphin in 1419, the new Duke, Philip the Good, broke with the Armagnac faction and allied with the English. This alliance between the Burgundians and the Plantagenets proved decisive. It gave Henry the internal political support needed to present himself not as an invader, but as a restorer of order. The Treaty of Troyes sealed this union in almost theatrical fashion. Charles VI recognized Henry V as the legitimate heir to the French crown, and to reinforce the agreement, Princess Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI, was given in marriage to Henry. The Dauphin Charles, biological son of the French king, was officially declared a bastard and disinherited, an act that not only rewrote dynastic succession, but deepened the abyss that divided France into two overlapping kingdoms. The treaty's impact on the integrity of the French kingdom was devastating. With Paris under Anglo-Burgundian control and the throne handed to a foreign king, the Dauphin Charles, who would later be known as Charles VII, took refuge in Bourges in south-central France, ruling informally and precariously from a resistance corps that included part of the loyal nobility and scattered fiefs. This period became known as the Kingdom of Bourges, and Charles, still young and lacking political or military weight, was seen by many as a paper king, a ghost of legitimacy in a country divided and occupied. While Henry V received honors, forged alliances, and captured city after city, Charles was forced to watch the symbolic loss of his homeland and birthright. From a legal standpoint, the Treaty of Troyes represented an unprecedented revolution. Never before had a French king disinherited his own son to hand the crown to a foreigner. The act's legality was questioned by many jurists and chroniclers of the time, but the monarchy was so weakened that there was little room for institutional resistance. The Burgundians, eager to preserve their influence and consolidate their territories, supported the treaty, and the English occupied Paris with local backing, presenting themselves as restorers of peace. Henry V, in turn, planned his coronation as King of France and began implementing administrative reforms in the occupied regions, adapting the English legal system to French practices in an effort to legitimize his future rule. However, fate would soon deliver a dramatic twist. In 1422, just 2 years after signing the treaty, Henry V died suddenly in Vincennes at the age of 35, a victim of dysentery. A few months later, Charles VI also passed away, formally ending the reign of the Capetian-Valois dynasty. According to the treaty, the crown was to pass to the child of Henry and Catherine, Henry VI, still a mere infant. This created an unprecedented situation. An English infant ruled by regents became king of both England and France, while the disinherited Dauphin Charles, stripped of Paris and legitimacy, proclaimed himself Charles VII, launching a new phase of the conflict. This chapter would no longer be defined by treaties and inheritances, but by spiritual, political, and military resistance, soon to find in a young peasant girl the symbol of its redemption. The Treaty of Troyes, despite its legal power and solid alliances, marked the peak of English dominance, but also its breaking point. By excluding the Dauphin and attempting to merge two historically rival kingdoms under a single foreign crown, England had taken the boldest, and perhaps most dangerous, step of the entire war. France, humiliated and fractured, seemed lost. But in the hearts of its people, in the memory of the land and in faith in divine salvation, something was stirring again, a silent resurgence in the countryside, among village chapels and church bells, preparing the way for a force no treaty could suppress. At a time when France seemed hopelessly split between an English child king and a disinherited Dauphin exiled in Bourges, when Paris was under English control, Reims was unreachable, and the French people lived in the shadow of a humiliating occupation, an improbable figure emerged from the rural heart of the country, a figure almost inconceivable by the standards of the time, a teenage peasant girl, illiterate, the daughter of farmers, with no noble lineage whatsoever, yet claiming a divine mission that would alter the course of the war and the destiny of France. Joan of Arc, born in Domremy on the banks of the Meuse, was, to the political and military elites of the 15th century, an anomaly. But in the logic of faith and despair, she was precisely what the people needed, a miracle with a human face. Joan claimed with unshakable conviction that since the age of 13 she had been hearing celestial voices, those of saints like Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, instructing her to fulfill a divine mission, to liberate France from English domination and to lead the Dauphin Charles to be crowned in Reims as tradition required. Her belief was so unwavering, so pure, that she won over priests, soldiers, nobles, and even pragmatic skeptics like Charles VII's advisors. The young woman reached the court at Chinon in 1429, where the Dauphin, disguised among the nobles, tried to test her. Joan, having never seen him before, recognized him immediately. In a France on the verge of collapse, Charles had no more weapons, no allies, and no faith. Joan offered him all three at once, and with them she ignited a new phase of the war. Against all odds, Joan was authorized to wear armor, wield a banner, and accompany the troops in battle. Yet her presence went far beyond military function. She did not command battles with maps and tactics, but with absolute faith, burning fervor, and a spiritual authority no one dared question. Her first major mission was the siege of Orléans, a city that had been under English siege for months. With Joan at the army's front, riding a white horse and carrying her banner bearing the image of Christ, French soldiers found renewed courage. In April 1429, they launched a counter-offensive. The siege was broken within days. For the first time in years, the French not only resisted, they triumphed. The victory at Orléans was more than a military achievement. It was a psychological rebirth. The people began to believe salvation was possible again. Deserters returned to the ranks. Cities that had once yielded to English occupation declared loyalty to Charles VII. Within weeks, the national flame had been reignited. Joan had become more than a leader. She was a symbol, a living prophet compared to biblical figures, quoted in sermons, and revered as a messenger of God. The campaign pressed on with a series of victories, culminating in the march to Reims, the sacred city where French kings were traditionally crowned. It was a dangerous crossing through enemy-held territory, yet the city surrendered without a fight. Joan's presence alone was enough. In July 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France in Reims, with Joan of Arc at his side, weeping, kneeling, declaring she had fulfilled the mission God had given her. It was the high point of French resistance, not just a political event, but a spiritual one. The disinherited Dauphin became king, not through treaties but through faith and courage. The coronation was a direct defiance of the Treaty of Troyes, a bold statement against English occupation, and a call for national unity. Joan didn't merely restore the legitimacy of a king, she restored the soul of France, but Joan's fate would not be one of continuous glory. In 1430, during a siege at Compiègne, she was captured by Burgundian forces, allies of the English, and sold as a prisoner of war. Taken to Rouen under English control, she was subjected to an ecclesiastical trial for heresy, orchestrated by clerics loyal to the English crown. The trial was a legal farce, filled with theological traps, contradictions, and manipulation. Joan was accused of dressing as a man, of hearing demonic voices, and of acting without church authority. Even in captivity, she remained steadfast. She never denied her visions, never renounced her mission. Condemned to death, she was burned alive on May 30th, 1431, at only 19 years old. Her final words, according to witnesses, were, "Jesus, Jesus." Joan's execution, far from extinguishing her influence, transformed her into a martyr. The people began to see her as a saint. Resistance intensified. King Charles VII, strengthened by his coronation, consolidated internal power, unified allies, and gradually drove the English out. In 1456, Joan was officially rehabilitated by the Church in a retrial. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. But long before that, she had already become eternal in the French imagination, a symbol of courage, faith, and redemption. Thus, Joan of Arc marked the profound and definitive turning point of the 100 Years' War. She was the one who elevated the French cause from a succession dispute to a spiritual crusade. She was the one who returned to the people the courage to resist. She was the one who raised the banner when all hope had been abandoned. And even in death she kept marching, in the voices of soldiers, in the eyes of children, in the prayers of villages that now knew that France, though wounded, could still rise again. The siege of Orléans, which took place between October 1428 and May 1429, was the pivotal moment of the 100 Years' War, when France's fate teetered dangerously between total destruction and unexpected redemption. The city of Orléans was the last strategic stronghold north of the Loire River, still under the control of the Dauphin Charles, a vital point for halting the English advance into the heart of French territory. If Orléans fell, the connection between the southern provinces and the royal power in Bourges would be severed, and France would be literally split in two. The English knew this. Their Burgundian allies did too. For months, enemy forces besieged the city patiently, building outposts, towers, ramparts, and blocking all supply routes. Surrender seemed only a matter of time. The people of the city, starving and desperate, watched day after day as their walls grew weaker and their hope thinner. The royal army, weakened and hesitant, refrained from launching an offensive to break the siege. The Dauphin himself, discredited and without resources, watched helplessly from afar. It was in this dark scenario that Joan of Arc appeared like an unexpected lightning bolt, bearing a certainty as unshakable as it was absurd. She would liberate Orléans in the name of God. When Joan arrived in the city in April 1429, she brought with her a small detachment, a letter to the garrison commander, and a white banner bearing the image of Christ. Her entry was met with an explosion of emotion. The bells rang, the streets filled, and even the most skeptical soldiers were seized by a long-lost energy. Hope began to breathe again. Within days, Joan reinvigorated the city's morale. She began participating in military councils, despite initial resistance from seasoned commanders. She insisted on launching direct offensives against English outposts, breaking the logic of a war of attrition. She led assaults on fortified bastions, always at the front, carrying her banner. Her presence was more powerful than a sword. Soldiers advanced with her, driven by a near-religious fervor. On May 7, 1429, during the assault on the Tourelle fort, one of the most crucial English positions, Joan was wounded in the shoulder by an arrow, but returned to the battlefield while still bleeding. This act inflamed the troops, leading to final victory. The next day, the English abandoned the siege. Orléans was free. The entire city erupted in celebration. For the first time in years, France tasted a victory that felt like a miracle. But Joan did not stop there. Convinced that her divine mission included the coronation of Charles VII in Reims, she organized, with the support of the king and his counselors, a daring expedition toward the sacred city. The journey was not merely military, it was symbolic. Reims, to the north, was in hostile territory, under Anglo-Burgundian influence. Reaching it meant crossing dozens of cities that might resist or betray them. But as the French army advanced, something extraordinary occurred. The cities surrendered without a fight. It was as if the very land acknowledged the legitimacy of the movement. Gates opened, bells rang, and Joan rode at the front, not leading an army but carrying an idea of the future. On July 17, 1429, in the Cathedral of Reims, Charles VII was crowned King of France, with Joan at his side in armor, holding her banner. The scene was described by witnesses as a political epiphany. The once disinherited, discredited king, besieged in his own land, was now officially anointed according to the millennia-old tradition of French monarchy. Reims, where centuries of kings had been crowned, became the stage for the rebirth of legitimacy. There were no English diplomats to interfere, no Burgundian allies to react. The ceremony was an act of faith and affirmation, a declaration that, despite the treaties, the occupations, and the losses, France still existed. For the people, the coronation was more than a formality. It was a return to cosmic order. An anointed king meant divine protection, historical continuity, and legitimate authority. Joan, who never asked for titles, positions, or rewards, knelt before the throne, stating her mission was fulfilled, but the impact of her actions would continue to echo. From that moment on, French morale solidified. Previously scattered troops reorganized. The now legitimized central government gained the strength to reclaim key regions. Charles VII's image transformed from ghost king to visible monarch, crowned and supported by the people. The siege of Orléans and the coronation in Reims were, together, the definitive turning point of the war. England, which had advanced with confidence until then, now faced a nation that not only resisted, but was reborn, and all of it thanks to the unbreakable faith of a peasant girl who heard voices, believed in them, and transformed the destiny of an entire kingdom with the force of conviction, courage, and hope. The liberation of Orléans and the coronation of Charles VII marked the pinnacle of Joan of Arc's journey. but they also ignited with equal intensity the resentment, fear, and hostility of those who could not accept a young, illiterate woman leading armies and influencing kings. Her rise, though celebrated by the people and some loyalist nobles, deeply unsettled the traditional aristocracy, the conservative clergy, and especially the political enemies who controlled Paris and the courts of Rouen. To the English, Joan was an existential threat. Her image had become a symbol of national resistance, and as long as she lived, the idea of France becoming English could never fully take hold. So when she was captured in 1430, her fate was sealed. She had to be destroyed, physically, morally, and spiritually. The capture occurred near the city of Compiègne during a skirmish with Burgundian troops. Joan was thrown from her horse and handed over as a prisoner to the English allies. She was swiftly sold for a considerable sum and taken to Rouen, where she would be tried. The trial, led by Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais and a declared partisan of the English, was carefully staged to appear as a canonical investigation, but in truth, it was a judicial farce with a predetermined verdict. The goal was not only to convict Joan of heresy, but also to symbolically invalidate her divine mission, thereby undermining the legitimacy of Charles VII, whose coronation she had made possible. For months, Joan was held in inhumane conditions. She was locked in a filthy cell, guarded by male soldiers, a direct violation of ecclesiastical norms regarding the imprisonment of women. She was interrogated repeatedly, without legal counsel, and in Latin, a language she did not understand. Despite this, Joan responded with disconcerting clarity. To their trap-laden questions, she replied with quick, spirited, and resolute answers. When asked whether she knew she was in God's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The judges expected a theological misstep, but found only simple and unwavering faith. The charges were numerous: heresy, witchcraft, idolatry, insubordination, dressing as a man, and even blasphemy for claiming to receive orders directly from saints. Her use of male clothing was exploited to the fullest, presented as proof of rebellion against divine law. But Joan explained she wore them out of necessity, for protection, to avoid abuse in prison, and because it was God's command. Throughout the process, her inquisitors tried to force her into contradictions, to deny her visions, to accept guilt. For a brief moment, under the threat of immediate execution, Joan signed a retraction, declaring she would abandon her clothes and visions. But just days later, she resumed wearing her warrior attire and reaffirmed her mission, saying she had been deceived. This gesture was interpreted as a relapse into heresy and sealed her sentence. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned alive in the old market square of Rouen before a silent crowd. She was only 19 years old. During the execution, she requested a crucifix. An English monk granted her request, and a soldier, moved, fashioned a small cross from 2 sticks. Joan was tied to the stake, and her final words, according to witnesses, were repeated like a prayer: "Jesus, Jesus." When the flames consumed her body, the executioner, according to accounts, cried out in panic that he had burned a saint. Her remains were reduced to ashes and thrown into the Seine, so no relic could remain. But Joan's memory could not be erased. Her death did not have the effect the English intended. Far from demoralizing the French cause, it transformed Joan into a national cult of resistance. Her image as a martyr spread across France, in villages, monasteries, and army ranks. Many soldiers began to carry small crosses in her honor. Peasants and clergy began reporting visions and miracles attributed to her. Charles VII, although he did nothing to save her during the trial, perhaps for political reasons, later ordered a rehabilitation process which in 1456 officially annulled the trial at Rouen and declared Joan innocent and unjustly condemned. Over time, Joan of Arc became more than a war heroine. She became an eternal symbol of France, patroness of the nation, an image of unwavering faith, of courage without armor, of a people who, even when subdued, find the strength to rise again. In 1920, she was canonized by the Catholic Church as Saint Joan of Arc, but her sainthood had long been acknowledged by the silent eyes of those who saw a young woman in armor carry hope through the scorched streets of a ruined country. The death of Joan of Arc in 1431 marked a moment of profound grief, but also a turning point in strategic consciousness. Far from annihilating French resistance, as the English had hoped, Her execution sparked a silent, yet powerful transformation in the military, political, and symbolic structures of Charles VII's kingdom. The monarchy, which until then had survived through improvisation, fragile alliances, and popular faith, began to follow a new path: the professionalization of war. Charles VII, now legitimized by his coronation and galvanized by Joan's sacrifice, understood that having the title of king was not enough. He needed to reconquer France, city by city, piece by piece. This new phase was defined by a deliberate project to rebuild military power. Charles VII initiated an unprecedented reform in French history. He created the first standing army in Western Europe. Until then, wars had been fought by feudal levies and temporary armies made up of noble knights and mercenaries, serving for limited periods. But modern warfare demanded continuity, discipline, and structure. With the help of advisors like Jacques Coeur, who reorganized the kingdom's finances, and Jean Bureau, an artillery expert, the king formed permanent companies, centralized military command, and standardized soldier equipment. War, which for centuries had been a feudal privilege, was now becoming a function of the state. France's main innovation during this period was the systematic use of artillery, a rising technology that began to change the battlefield. Cast-iron cannons, though still rudimentary, were increasingly used effectively during sieges of English fortresses. The French began building foundries, developing ballistics, and training specialized artillerymen. Simultaneously, the army adopted tactics based on mobility, prolonged sieges, and coordinated advances, abandoning the direct charges that had cost dearly in battles like Crécy and Agincourt. Each new campaign was carefully planned, with attention to logistics, terrain, and popular support. It was a war of patient recovery, based on knowledge, infrastructure, and a budding sense of nationalism. The effects of this reorganization were immediate and visible. Starting in 1435, French advances gained momentum. In a decisive move, the Treaty of Arras, signed that year, ended the alliance between the English and the Burgundians. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, reconciled with Charles VII in exchange for autonomy and pardon for the murder of John the Fearless. This reconciliation shattered the backbone of English power in France. Paris, long held by the English, was gradually isolated. In 1436, French troops retook the capital, an event of immense symbolic value. The city returned to the hands of its legitimate king. The people, having endured years of occupation, welcomed the blue fleur-de-lis banners with tears and songs. The reconquest continued across northern and central France. Rouen, the city where Joan had been martyred, was reclaimed. Caen fell. Bordeaux, the last English stronghold in Aquitaine, held out for years, but ultimately surrendered. The French army, now disciplined, unified, and well-equipped, had become a force capable of launching sustained campaigns, controlling territories, and administering reconquered cities. Each victory was followed by the restoration of royal justice, organized tax collection, and the promotion of a growing national identity. France, once a shattered land, was emerging as a modern, centralized kingdom aware of its own unity. Meanwhile, England was collapsing. Henry VI, the boy king who had inherited the crowns of both England and France, proved fragile, indecisive, and easily manipulated by the nobility. Parliament debated budget cuts. The population, exhausted by decades of taxes and distant wars, began to revolt. Discontent spread across villages and internal instability grew. It was the prelude to what would later erupt as the Wars of the Roses. England, once an uncontested military power, became a prisoner of its own divisions, while France unified under the calm but resolute leadership of Charles VII. The final French offensive in the war was more than a series of victories. It was the consolidation of a new model of state. Charles VII, often remembered as the ungovernable king, or the King of Joan, proved to be a quiet strategist. He ruled for 39 years, and by the end of his reign, France had regained nearly all its lost territories, with only the city of Calais remaining under English control. The country, once divided by treaties, ravaged by invaders, and shaken by plague and madness, now stood restored, not with empty promises but with institutions, permanent armies, strong currency, and a king who, despite early doubts, fulfilled his role with resilience. Thus the final French offensive sealed not only a military victory over the English, but the birth of a modern France, The war that began as a dynastic dispute between two kings became, over more than a century, a journey of national self-definition. And in this new era, victory was no longer won by sword alone. It required governance through wisdom, unity through justice, and inspiration through example. Charles VII understood this, and Joan, through her blood, had already foretold it. The 100 Years' War, which for over a century devastated fields, villages, and royal crowns, reached its definitive military conclusion at the Battle of Castillon, fought on July 17, 1453, in the Gascony region. It was there, on the fertile plains near the Dordogne River, that the once dominant English army suffered the final blow, one that not only ended open hostilities, but also symbolically closed the long and painful English attempt to dominate France. Though less renowned than Crécy, Poitiers, or Agincourt, the Battle of Castillon represented the military collapse of what had been seen for generations as a permanent English presence. Unlike the glorious clashes of old, Castillon was a silent, decisive massacre, not won by cavalry, but by the new queen of the battlefield, artillery. The context was clear. France had reconquered nearly all the territories lost after the Treaty of Bretigny. Paris was French once more. The central government functioned, and the nobility was under the control of King Charles VII. Only Bordeaux and a few holdings in Gascony remained under English rule, symbolic remnants of the once powerful Plantagenet Empire on the continent. In 1451, the French took Bordeaux, but months later the English, led by John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, retook the city with the help of segments of the local population still loyal to England. Determined to extinguish English presence once and for all, Charles VII organized a decisive campaign. He assembled troops, supplies, and, most importantly, a formidable artillery force led by Jean Bureau, the architect of France's military modernization. The French army marched southward, and the English, fully aware of Bordeaux's importance, sought to intercept them at Castillon, where the French had established a fortified camp, complete with earthworks, trenches, and rows of cannons ready to repel any attack. John Talbot, confident in his reputation and English prestige, launched an immediate assault without waiting for reinforcements, convinced the French were in retreat. That miscalculation would prove fatal. At dawn on July 17th, his troops charged the French positions, crossing open fields under a relentless storm of cannon fire. The French artillery, for the first time, was coordinated, protected, and devastatingly lethal. The English advance quickly turned into tragedy. Hundreds of men were shredded before reaching the enemy lines. Those who did make it close were repelled by a well-positioned infantry with unwavering artillery support. Confusion escalated when French reinforcements arrived, completing the encirclement and flanking the English. John Talbot was mortally wounded, and his son, fighting at his side, also fell. Talbot's death, he was a legendary figure in the war, was the psychological breaking point. The survivors attempted to retreat but were hunted down and massacred. The defeat was absolute. Within hours, the English army had been annihilated, and the dream of maintaining Gascony was dead. Following Castillon, Bordeaux surrendered for good. This marked the end of England's military presence in continental France, with the exception of Calais, which would remain under English control for another 100 years, though without any real influence on European power dynamics. The 100 Years' War, born of dynastic disputes and fueled by ambition, pride, and fragile alliances, ended not with grand fanfare, but in the muffled thunder of Jean Bureau's cannons. A new France emerged, centralized, victorious, and technologically advanced, from the ashes of its own destruction. Meanwhile, defeated on the continent, England soon plunged into its own civil war, the Fax Wars of the Roses. Closing the door on any remaining imperial aspirations abroad, Castillon was not just the final battle, it was a turning point between two eras. It marked the end of cavalry as the dominant force, the triumph of artillery over the sword, of organization over bravado. War was no longer decided by noblemen in shining armor, but by the precision of gunners, the efficiency of logistics, and the authority of the state. Talbot's death, symbol of England's warrior tradition, was almost theatrical, the fall of a world no longer ruled by knights, but by standing armies, gunpowder weapons, and centralized command. Castillon ended a century of bloodshed with a clear message: The medieval age was giving way to a new order, and so, in 1453, the Hundred Years' War came to an end, not with triumphal music, but with cannon smoke, not with glorious treaties, but with inevitable surrenders. France was reborn and England withdrew. Europe began to awaken to modernity, and the echoes of that war, its pain and lessons, would resonate for centuries. The Hundred Years' War began as a typical conflict of medieval chivalry, dominated by lances, longbows, and gleaming armor. But it ended under the muffled roar of gunpowder and the crushing impact of artillery. The introduction and refinement of firearms, particularly cannons, were decisive not only for the French victory, but for the profound transformation of warfare as it had been known. Through the technological advancement driven by the reign of Charles VII and the technical prowess of men like Joan and Gaspard Bureau, brothers and architects of French artillery, the balance of military power was redefined. Cast iron, gunpowder, and ballistic calculations gradually replaced the honor codes of chivalry, imposing a new logic on the battlefield. In the early years of the war, artillery was used timidly. Primitive cannons, unreliable and prone to misfires or internal explosions, played more of a symbolic than practical role. But from the 1430s onward, the French made massive investments in this technology. They established royal foundries, standardized the size of cannonballs, trained specialized craftsmen and, most importantly, integrated artillery systematically into military strategy. This enabled them to bring down city walls in hours, a process that previously took weeks or even months of siege. The efficiency of this new system became evident in each city reclaimed during the final offensives, especially at Castillon, where French cannons were placed within fortified earthworks, protected by stakes, trenches, and infantry. It was a defensive system so efficient that not even the traditional strength of an English army led by Talbot could breach it. The presence of artillery transformed military architecture itself. Medieval castles with high towers and vertical walls became obsolete under the concentrated impact of cannon fire. Siege warfare was reinvented. Instead of heroic assaults and gate battles, it was now sufficient to position artillery correctly, maintain sustained fire, and blast openings in the wall until the garrison surrendered. Cities that had resisted assaults for centuries with impenetrable fortifications now fell in a matter of days. This advance also forced defenders to adapt their fortresses, building lower bastions, angled reinforcements, and counter-artillery positions. Thus began the slow emergence of modern fortifications, which would dominate military engineering until the 17th century. Beyond cannons, the use of handheld firearms also began to grow. Though arquebusiers were still limited in number and effectiveness during the Hundred Years' War, their presence increased year by year. The mere fact that an untrained commoner, armed with powder and a crude weapon, could wound an armored knight began to erode the symbolic foundations of feudal warfare. The monopoly on armed violence, long held by the warrior aristocracy, was now opening to paid, disciplined soldiers in standing companies under the direct orders of the state. Gunpowder democratized lethality, and with it, power. The logistics of artillery, in turn, demanded structural changes. Cannons had to be forged, tons of iron and powder transported, engineers trained, and ballistics calculated. This required centralized administration, continuous funding, and meticulous planning. In other words, it required a strong state, and France, after decades of chaos, was beginning to become that state. Charles VII himself realized that mastering artillery was more than a military advantage. It was a foundation of governance. While England descended into instability, France established permanent arsenals, artillery officers, and technical manuals, laying the groundwork for a model that other European kingdoms would later emulate. The psychological impact was equally devastating. The sound of cannons, the stench of gunpowder, the terror that spread among besieged garrisons as they watched their walls crumble, all of it reshaped the perception of what war could be. The time of solemn cavalry gave way to the era of methodical sieges, calculated bombardment, and victory without glory but with efficiency. Commanders began to value engineers and craftsmen as much as knights. Warfare became professionalized, and with it, the first outlines of the modern army emerged. Thus, the use of artillery and firearms was not a technical footnote in the Hundred Years' War. It was its final instrument, its closing language, and at the same time, the announcement of a new world. A world where kings ruled by more than lineage, they ruled through efficiency. A world where gunpowder spoke louder than coats of arms. A world where war was no longer the domain of nobles, but a tool of the state. And in that new world, France asserted itself as a rising power, not through the strength of its shields, but through the reach of its cannons. The end of the 100 Years' War, more than concluding a conflict between France and England, marked a structural transformation in the balance of power within European kingdoms. If, at the beginning of the war, the king was merely primus inter pares, the first among equals, in relation to a powerful territorial aristocracy, by the end of the conflict, the monarch had emerged as the unquestionable central authority, upheld not by feudal oaths, but by an autonomous military, fiscal, and administrative apparatus. In France, this transition was particularly evident. The long process of resistance and reconquest profoundly strengthened the figure of the king, while the old warrior nobility, once dominant, saw its political and military influence wane. In the early stages of the war, feudal lords played a central role. They raised their own armies, imposed local taxes, administered justice, and defended their lands like small kings. But the prolonged instability revealed the limits of that model. The decentralization of power hindered the kingdom's ability to respond effectively. In response, Charles VII, and later his successors, began to gradually replace feudal authority with permanent state structures. The army, for instance, was no longer a force occasionally assembled by vassal knights. It became directly maintained by the crown, with wages paid in royal coin and recruitment organized by the state. This marked the birth of the Frais, French royal army, funded by centralized taxation and loyal to the king, not to local lords. The impact of this on the nobility was profound. Deprived of their exclusive control over armed force, many nobles saw their power hollowed out. Feudal fortresses, which for centuries had stood as both symbols and tools of autonomy, became prime targets for royal artillery. In many cases, castles were dismantled or confiscated. Judicial authority was also gradually stripped from the barons. Royal courts began to operate in areas once controlled by seigneurial jurisdictions. Furthermore, with the strengthening of the national currency and the rebuilding of public finances, the French crown gained the ability to fund infrastructure, manage trade routes, and intervene directly in regional economies, responsibilities that had traditionally been in the hands of the local aristocracy. This process was not without resistance. Numerous conspiracies and local uprisings marked the years following the war. Nobles, accustomed to absolute power over their lands, attempted to restore their prestige through force. However, the royal administrative machine proved increasingly efficient, unyielding, and inevitable. The growing urban bourgeoisie began to support the king, exchanging protection and stability for commercial privileges and representation in royal councils. Peasants, weary of war and feudal plundering, saw in royal authority a promise of order. The monarch, once distant and abstract, became present, tangible, enforced by a standing army and an expanding bureaucratic structure. From a symbolic perspective, this transition was equally striking. War, especially in its final phases, was no longer associated with the glory of noble lineage, but with the interests of the kingdom as a whole. Joan of Arc, for example, was celebrated as a divine envoy who fought not for a fief or a bloodline, but for the homeland. This idea of a national interest superseding hereditary and local rights marked a paradigm shift. The monarchy transformed into a national institution, not just a dynastic one. This conception, nurtured by war and solidified by peace, took deep root in France's political consciousness. The centralization of power also had immediate practical consequences. After the war, Charles VII implemented new forms of tax collection, such as the taille, a direct levy on peasants that funded the army and royal services. He also created professional officials, such as baillis and sénéchaux, to administer provinces in the king's name. These agents, often drawn from the educated bourgeoisie, replaced the old feudal lords in local governance. It was the triumph of competence over lineage. The king ceased to be merely a symbol. He became the manager of the realm, present in every village through his appointed officials. Thus, the primary political consequence of the 100 Years' War was the collapse of feudal power and the rise of the modern state. France emerged from a century of devastation stronger than it had entered, with defined borders, a regular army, a national currency, and a king who was no longer beholden to his vassals, but the absolute commander of an administrative and military machine. This model would inspire other European monarchies and form the foundation of the absolutism of the following centuries. The conflict between kings and barons gave way to the centralized kingdom, to vertical authority, to the indivisible power of the crown, and from that process, a new era was born, a time when politics was no longer conducted solely with swords, but with decrees, a time when royalty was measured not by genealogy, but by the ability to govern. The war had ended, but the state it forged would shape the centuries to come, forever. While France emerged from the 100 Years' War stronger, more centralized and revitalized, England, in contrast, descended into one of the most chaotic periods in its history. The prolonged effort to maintain territories on the continent, the immense human and financial cost of the war, and the frustration of ultimate defeat triggered a political collapse that paved the way for a new and brutal sequence of conflicts. The Wars of the Roses, a bloody civil war between two noble houses, the Lancasters and the Yorks, vying for the English throne. Thus the end of the external war marked, for England, the beginning of a domestic nightmare that would last over 30 years, corroding the monarchy's prestige and plunging the country into a vortex of betrayals, fratricidal battles, and institutional instability. The immediate impact of the defeat in the 100 Years' War was profound. England had lost nearly all of its continental possessions, with the exception of Calais, the last remnant of Plantagenet glory in France. This loss was felt not just as a military setback, but as a national humiliation. For decades, English kings had claimed the title of rightful heirs to the French crown. Suddenly, all those ambitions crumbled in the face of an exhausted populace, a divided nobility, and a monarch, Henry VI, who lacked both the strength and cunning to manage the crisis. Unlike his bellicose predecessors like Edward III or Henry V, Henry VI was frail, introspective, deeply religious, and frequently incapacitated by episodes of mental collapse, rendering him incapable of ruling. These leadership crises created a vacuum that unleashed fierce court rivalries. Without a strong central figure, the English nobility began to form factions, competing not only for influence, but for control of the crown itself. Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's wife, tried to maintain power on her husband's behalf, but her French origins and strong sway over royal councils only deepened aristocratic resentment. Among the discontented nobles stood Richard, Duke of York, a direct descendant of Edward III, who claimed the throne for himself, asserting superior rights over those of the House of Lancaster. This dynastic conflict, initially covert, quickly escalated into open war. The Wars of the Roses, named after the heraldic symbols of the two houses, the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster, officially began in 1455, just 2 years after the Battle of Castillon. The battles of this civil war were not fought against foreign powers, but between English noble factions, their private armies ravaging villages, seizing castles, and executing rivals. The country, once obsessed with claiming the French crown, now saw its own towns devastated by internal strife. Royal authority was toppled and restored so many times that it often seemed non-existent. Henry VI was deposed, reinstated, and deposed again, in a cycle of instability that claimed the lives of dozens of prominent noble figures. This internal collapse had long-lasting effects. The Civil War depleted the power of many great feudal families, many of which were wiped out or financially ruined. It also weakened Parliament and discredited the monarchy, which came to be seen not as a symbol of stability, but as a battlefield for rival interests. Only with the rise of Henry Tudor in 1485, after his victory at the Battle of Bosworth, would England know relative peace again. Henry VII, by uniting the houses of Lancaster and York through marriage, founded the Tudor dynasty and initiated a policy of state reconstruction, inspired in part by centralized continental models. Like France under Charles VII, England too would gradually move toward monarchical centralization, but its path was far more tortuous and bloody. It is crucial to understand that the Wars of the Roses were not merely an isolated episode, but a direct consequence of the scars left by the 100 Years' War. National frustration over defeat, economic ruin from decades of warfare, the disbanding of armies, and the presence of thousands of unemployed armed men created fertile ground for collapse. The English monarchy, which had reached its zenith under Henry V, plummeted into decline under Henry VI. The instability stemmed not only from hereditary disputes, but from a broader crisis of identity, of authority, and of political structure. While France consolidated its political and administrative rebirth, England had to relearn how to govern itself. And to do so, it first had to destroy itself in order to rebuild. The price of imperial ambition proved too high, and the crown, which once gleamed on foreign fields, was now stained with English blood, in a cycle of war that would transform the very concept of kingship and lay the groundwork for even deeper changes in the century to come. The 100 Years' War was not merely a long sequence of battles over territories or thrones. It was, in fact, a turning point in the course of civilization, a profound process of transition between two worlds, the feudal, hierarchical, and decentralized Middle Ages, and the modern age, defined by the centralized states, technological warfare, and new concepts of sovereignty and national identity. Over its 116 years, the conflict served as a historical crucible, where old structures crumbled and new forms of social, political, and military organization were forged, many of them irreversible. It was a war that, while destroying the old, paved the way for the new. In the political realm, the most visible impact was the rise of the centralized national monarchy. Before the war, both in France and England, the king relied on alliances with the feudal nobility, whose lands, armies, and tributes formed the backbone of royal power. During the war, that dependency proved unsustainable. The need for continuous campaigns, professional armies, and constant supply chains forced monarchs to build their own administrative structures. This led to the creation of permanent bureaucracies, systematic national taxation, and royal courts that began to supersede feudal jurisdictions. The king ceased to be a mere arbitrator among barons and became a sovereign with direct authority over his people and territory. This centralization was accompanied by an equally novel phenomenon, the rise of a national consciousness. Until then, most peasants, and even nobles, identified more with their village, lordship, or lineage than with any abstract entity called France or England. But the long conflict, widespread mobilization efforts, and shared symbols, such as Joan of Arc's cross, the anthem God Save the King, royal banners, or war martyrs, began to foster the bonds of collective identity. Populations on both sides began to see themselves as part of distinct nations, separated by language, culture, and destiny. This marks what modern historians refer to as the birth of European national identities. In the military sphere, the transformation was even more brutal. The war exposed the end of feudal cavalry supremacy, replaced by standing armies, heavy artillery, and strategies based on logistics and discipline rather than individual bravery. The lone knight, once the pinnacle of medieval warfare, became obsolete in the face of cannons, organized pike formations, and state-funded companies. Longbows had already altered the power dynamic, but it was gunpowder that sealed the fate of traditional warfare. This required new types of soldiers, new command structures, and a state capable of financing and managing such machinery. War became a science, and science a tool of governance. Socially, the war triggered seismic shifts. The feudal nobility suffered major blows, both from battlefield deaths and the loss of political autonomy. At the same time, the urban bourgeoisie ascended. Merchants, bankers, and literate clerks began to hold influential positions near the king, offering the resources and skills needed for the new centralized administration. The mass mobilization of peasants, artisans, and mercenaries for the war effort also shifted the social balance. Though class hierarchies remained rigid, the foundations of society began to shift, laying the groundwork for future revolutions. Economically, the damage was vast, but also prompted creative responses. The French countryside, devastated by decades of warfare, saw the emergence of more resilient agricultural practices, tighter-knit communities, and more rationalized tax systems. The war also accelerated the development of public accounting. With systematic records of expenditures, revenue, and loans, the need to maintain armies and rebuild cities stimulated monetary circulation, internal trade, and the strengthening of regional trade routes. These changes would contribute to significant economic expansion in the following century. Culturally, the Hundred Years' War marked the end of an era. The theocentric worldview, based on fixed and immutable orders, began to be challenged by the brutal reality of human conflict, the central role of non-noble individuals, and the emergence of literature increasingly focused on human drama rather than the deeds of saints and knights. Joan of Arc, for instance, represents a symbolic rupture with medieval norms, a woman, a peasant, without noble lineage, yet a central figure in national history. She foreshadowed a new historical sensibility, more complex, critical, and pluralistic. In summary, the Hundred Years' War was the painful bridge between two worlds. It began under the banners of chivalry and ended under the flash of artillery. It was born of dynastic disputes, but it ended by shaping national states. It was war, but also a birth. The birth of a new Europe, one that now understood that power depended on taxation, that loyalty could be owed to a flag and not just a lord, and that history was made not only by great names, but by the anonymous multitudes who wielded spears, forged cannons, and fought to survive. More than a military event, the Hundred Years' War left an indelible mark on Europe's collective memory. It not only shaped modern politics and states, but also created myths, traumas, icons, and narratives that influenced the culture, art, religion, and identity of generations. The prolonged conflict, the heroes who became legends, the martyrs who inspired faith, the horrors endured by entire populations, all of it fueled a deep and lasting symbolic legacy. The European imagination began to see war not only as destruction, but as a stage for moral, religious, and national revelations. In many ways, the legacy of the Hundred Years' War is one of memory, identity, and transcendence. The most powerful and emblematic figure of this legacy is, without a doubt, Joan of Arc. Her brief journey, from illiterate peasant girl who claimed to hear divine voices, to army leader, to being burned at the stake for heresy, became one of the most potent myths in Western culture. At once saint, warrior, martyr, and symbol of the nation, Joan was canonized by the Church centuries later, but her image transcended religious dogma. She became an inspiration for writers, painters, politicians, and filmmakers. The Maid of Orleans embodies the strength of individual faith, the power of popular action, and the courage to challenge the structures of power, all of it in a female body, in a world ruled by men. Joan became the ultimate symbol of French resistance, not only against England, but against any form of foreign domination, including during the Napoleonic Wars and the Nazi occupation. Beyond her, other names also took on legendary contours. Edward, the Black Prince, was idealized as the perfect knight, brave, refined, just, despite the brutality of his campaigns. John Talbot, who died at Castillon, became the last hero of English chivalry, a symbol of loyalty and honor in the face of inexorable change. These figures were romanticized over the centuries through poems, chronicles, and plays. In England, Shakespeare immortalized the Hundred Years' War. In his history plays, especially the Henry VI trilogy and Henry V, where the monarch is portrayed as a charismatic leader and strategist. These works cemented the war as a founding episode of English identity, where heroism, sacrifice, and the fate of the nation are forever interwoven in immortal verse. On a broader symbolic level, the war helped solidify the idea of the Mar nation as something worth dying for. Before it, loyalties were local, tied to lords, cities, or fiefs. But the Hundred Years' War was a collective experience, one that spanned generations and involved entire populations in common causes. That shared suffering, the sieges, the battles, the taxes, the forced displacements, created a sense of collective belonging. The French people began to see the monarchy as a symbol of unity. The English, in turn, started to redefine their identity in contrast to the continent, a sentiment that centuries later would evolve into British isolationism and insular pride. Artistically, the war became an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Illuminated manuscripts from the time, like the Chronicles of Froissart, depict battles, sieges, and armor with stunning visual detail. The war also inspired popular ballads, laments, chivalric literature, and religious prayers that circulated widely. Many of these artistic expressions blended fact and fiction, creating a symbolic tapestry where the harsh reality of war was softened by magical, epic, or religious elements. This imagination not only reconstructed the past, but also taught future generations about courage, sacrifice, and faith. Religiously, the war had equally profound symbolic implications. It was experienced as divine punishment, a test of faith, a battlefield where saints and sinners were revealed. Joan of Arc was seen as a messenger of God, the deaths of kings and nobles as signs of divine wrath. Sermons, relics, processions, and fasts were used as spiritual resistance to the war. Many monks and theologians wrote about the conflict as an expression of the battle between good and evil, between the anointed king and the usurpers, between true faith and heresy. Thus, the war was not only geopolitical, it was also theological, moral, and metaphysical. Even after it ended, the 100 Years' War continued to be evoked as a reference for legitimacy and national identity. Revolutions, occupations, and political upheavals often drew strength from its symbols and heroic past. The memory of its battles, martyrs, and victories became part of the mental landscape of European peoples. And so, even though it ended in 1453, the war never truly disappeared. It transformed into memory, and memory, by definition, is a form of eternity. The 100 Years' War was not merely a succession of formal battles and diplomatic treaties. It was also a universe of details, customs, hardships, and inventions that shaped the daily lives of both soldiers and civilians. Behind the immortal names of kings and heroes lay the concrete realities, made of steel, mud, hunger, prayers, and fear. In this segment, we delve into some of the most fascinating curiosities of the period, from the types of armor used to the most creative strategies and symbols that defined the identity of fighters and nations, not to mention the invisible enemies, like disease, which claimed more lives than spears or arrows. Let us begin with the armor. During the 14th century, the typical knight wore a chainmail hauberk, accompanied by a helmet and shield. However, over time, especially in the 15th century, this evolved into the plate armor, which fully protected the body with articulated sheets of polished steel. These suits were tailor-made, extremely expensive, and often weighed between 20 and 30 kilograms, distributed evenly to avoid hindering movement. They offered excellent protection against cuts and stabs, but were vulnerable to blunt force and, later, to early gunpowder projectiles. Interestingly, contrary to popular belief, a man in full armor could ride a horse, run, and fight with relative agility. Yet on muddy fields like Azincourt, even the best-equipped knight could be reduced to prey. Warfare strategies also changed dramatically. Early in the conflict, pitched battles dominated, with heavy cavalry charges and infantry support. However, the English began adopting tactics centered around our longbows, especially using peasant archers trained to shoot dozens of arrows per minute. These archers were protected by stakes planted in the ground to block enemy cavalry charges. This strategy proved devastating at Crécy, Poitiers, and Azincourt. In response, the French, after repeated defeats, shifted their approach to include siege warfare, artillery deployment, skirmishes, and economic blockades. Warfare ceased to be about individual bravery and came to rely on logistics, supply lines, and patience, characteristics more aligned with the modern world than with feudal chivalry. But not all dangers came from swords. Throughout the long years of war, diseases and plagues spread with devastating frequency. The most infamous of them was the Black Death, which arrived in Europe in 1347 and wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of the continent's population. The plague directly impacted the war. Entire armies were decimated without a single battle. Cities were abandoned, fields left fallow, and scarcity triggered new waves of famine. Beyond the plague, dysentery, typhoid fever, smallpox, and common infections ran rampant, worsened by the lack of hygiene in military camps. Minor wounds could become gangrenous and fatal within days. Field doctors and surgeons were rare, and the most common cures involved bloodletting, boiled herbs, and fervent prayer. The war was also rich in symbols and heraldry, visual elements that identified not just individuals, but entire armies and nations. Every noble bore their coat of arms on shields, cloaks, and banners. The English used the three golden lions on a red background, symbol of the Plantagenet house. France, in turn, displayed the golden fleur-de-lis on blue. Joan of Arc, for example, marched under a white banner bearing the image of God holding the world, flanked by angels. These symbols were not merely decorative. They served practical purposes for organizing troops and reinforcing identity amid battlefield chaos. They were also loaded with religious and moral meaning. Losing a banner was a disaster, recovering one, an act worthy of song. Another curious aspect was the use of field passwords, secret phrases that allowed soldiers to distinguish friend from foe at night or in the fog. Troops were issued specific terms to repeat when challenged by friendly patrols. In longer campaigns, they also used sound signals, drums, trumpets, bells, to coordinate movements. Some armies even developed their own dialects or used visual flag codes. Such systems were essential in an era of slow communication and high risk of confusion. Finally, among the most touching curiosities, we find the presence of women, children, and the elderly. Behind the scenes of the war, often forgotten by official chroniclers, these individuals formed what historians call camp followers, people who accompanied the armies selling food, mending clothes, treating wounds, or collecting the dead after battles. They were part of a parallel world of survival, trade, and care, sustaining the war effort without wielding weapons. Joan of Arc was merely the most famous among many women who actively participated in the conflict, though most did so invisibly. The 100 Years' War was a world made of steel and flesh, of faith and gunpowder, of bravery and disease, a world where the smallest details, a coat of arms, an arrow, a whispered password, could change the course of history. And it is in these details that the war remains alive, not just in books, but in the imagination it left behind. More than 6 centuries have passed since the last shots, the final cries, the whispered prayers in the muddy trenches that marked the end of the 100 Years' War. And yet, this war, long, uneven, full of twists and turns, remains alive, not only in history books but in culture, language, symbols, and the way we understand what a nation is, what power means, and what war truly entails. But why, after all, do we still speak of the 100 Years' War? Why does it occupy such a vast space in European and global memory? The answer lies not just in the battles it waged, but in the world it helped transform, and in what it still has to teach us about ourselves. We speak of this war first and foremost because it marked the end of one era and the birth of another. The Middle Ages, with its castles, knights, feudal alliances, and wars fought in the name of royal bloodlines, gave way to a new reality in which strong states, organized populations, and national interests began to dictate the course of politics. It was during the 100 Years' War that the figure of the king evolved from a mere heir to a throne into a symbol of a nation, a living expression of a people, a language, a land. And this process, however painful and slow, became one of the foundational pillars of Western modernity. We speak of it also because it gave us myths and martyrs. Joan of Arc is not merely a historical figure, she is an archetype. The young peasant girl who, driven by faith, rose up against oppression and inspired an entire nation tells a story that transcends time and place. Joan is not only France's, she belongs to humanity. Just as the Black Prince, Henry V, Charles VII, and so many others embodied the dilemmas of power, ambition, honor, and downfall, the 100 Years' War offers a gallery of human figures who, in their contradictions, continue to speak to the present. Furthermore, we continue to talk about it because it was a laboratory for modern warfare. It gave rise to lessons in military tactics, resource administration, use of artillery, disease spread, population control, taxation, and centralization of power. All these elements, which still shape the contemporary landscape of conflict, had their first organized expressions during this war. The administrative structures created to sustain the war effort gave birth to modern states. The methods of popular mobilization laid the groundwork for future democracies. And even the early sparks of collective resistance to invaders began to shape the symbolic vocabulary of modern patriotism. We talk about the 100 Years' War because it was also a mirror of the human soul in times of collapse. It showed what we are capable of when driven by fear, by faith, by hope, or by thirst for power. It revealed how war can devastate entire generations, but also how it can uncover unexpected courage, profound solidarities, and irreversible change. Every looted village, every besieged city, every fleeing peasant family, every woman sewing a banner or burying her child, all these gestures form a mosaic of humanity in the face of suffering. And that mosaic, even in silence, still speaks. Finally, we speak of the 100 Years' War, because it is a foundational memory. For France, it was a cry of national affirmation. For England, it was the pain of imperial decline. For Europe, it marked the first conscious step towards centralized states and cultural identities. But above all, we remember this war because it reminds us of something essential, that no empire, however powerful it may seem, is eternal, that no political order, however established, is immune to change, and that, between the mud of battlefields and the altars of cathedrals, between gunpowder and prayers, between defeat and resistance, it is the human condition that is revealed, fragile, contradictory, but eternally capable of beginning again. The 100 Years' War is over, but its story continues, because it doesn't live only in the fields where it was fought, but in the questions it still forces us to ask, about who we are, about how we got here, and about what we're willing to do or to lose to build tomorrow.